She stepped off that stagecoach, and the first thing Harlan's Crossing gave her was laughter. Not the polite kind, not the nervous kind people swallow behind their hands, the open, ugly kind, the kind that travels across a frozen street and lands like a slap. "Lord Almighty," said Dorothy Reeves, loud enough for 3 women beside her to hear. "Caleb Whitaker sent for a bride and they sent him a barn." The laughter spread. Mabel Hartwell stood on that frozen mud street with her travel bag in one hand and a small wooden crate tucked under her other arm, and she did not flinch. She heard every word. Her jaw tightened, just barely, just enough for anyone paying close attention to notice. And then she exhaled through her nose, slow and deliberate, the way a person does when they have spent a lifetime deciding not to let the world see them bleed. She looked up at the mountain. She said she was ready. If you have ever felt like the world decided what you were worth before you ever opened your mouth, stay with me. This story is for you. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and the bell so you never miss what comes next. Stories like Mabel's don't come around often, and the ones ahead are even more powerful. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that frozen street in 1879 and watch what happens when everyone is wrong. The stagecoach had been running 4 hours behind schedule, which meant the small crowd that gathered outside Harlan's Crossing's only general store had been standing in the cold long enough to get mean about it. That was the thing about small mountain settlements in the winter of 1879. There wasn't much entertainment, and a mail-order bride arriving for the reclusive rancher up on the eastern slope was the closest thing to a spectacle the town had seen since old Mercer's mule kicked through the wall of the post office back in August. People needed something to talk about. They needed something to measure themselves against. Caleb Whitaker was already measuring. He stood apart from the cluster of townspeople, shoulders hunched inside his coat, hat pulled low. He was 41 years old and looked every year of it, hands roughened from decades of fence wire and cold, a jaw that hadn't seen a proper shave in longer than he could honestly remember, eyes the color of weathered timber. He was not a handsome man, and he did not pretend to be. He was useful. That was the word he would have chosen for himself if he'd been given to that kind of reflection, which he wasn't. He had written the letter to the agency 6 months ago, and he had written it the way he did everything, with as few unnecessary words as possible. Seeking a practical woman. Must be capable of hard work and cold winters. Cooking and household management essential. Conversation optional. I am not a romantic man and do not expect romance in return. I offer a clean home, fair treatment, and honest partnership. The agency had written back with Mabel Hartwell's name and a short description. 34 years old, experienced in home management, strong constitution, sensible temperament. There had been no portrait, which Caleb had not thought to request. He had assumed, and this assumption revealed more about him than he understood at the time, that a woman who described herself as practical and durable would be ordinary in appearance. Neat. Manageable. He had not imagined Mabel. When she stepped down from the stagecoach, the first thing he noticed was her size. She was a large woman, full-figured, broad-shouldered, with a heaviness that was not soft but solid, the kind that spoke of physicality and endurance rather than indulgence. Her dress was patched at the hem but clean. Her hair was dark and pulled back plainly. Her face was not beautiful by the standards Harlan's Crossing would have recognized, but it was a face that was difficult to look away from. Strong-boned, clear-eyed, utterly composed. She carried a worn leather travel bag on one shoulder. She balanced the wooden crate against her hip. She looked around the street with the careful attention of someone arriving in a place they intend to understand. Dorothy Reeves made her remark. The laughter went up. And Mabel did that thing with her jaw, that small, almost invisible tightening. And then she breathed out, and then she looked at the mountain. Caleb watched all of it. He felt something he could not immediately name. It took him a moment to recognize it as shame, a sensation he hadn't experienced in so long he'd nearly forgotten the weight of it. He walked toward her. "Miss Hartwell," he said. He did not extend a hand. He wasn't sure he should. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were dark brown, nearly black, and they assessed him with a directness that most women in 1879 did not aim at a man they'd just met. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. Her voice was level. Not warm, not cold. Measured. "I have a wagon at the end of the street," he said. I can see it, she said. Is it yours or borrowed? Mine. Good. I'd rather not start a debt with a neighbor before I've had a chance to learn anyone's name. She shifted the crate under her arm. I assume you'll want to load the bag yourself. He didn't know what to make of that. He took the bag. Behind them, Dorothy Reeves was still talking. He could hear her without trying. That particular carrying quality her voice had, like a rock dropped into still water. He'll have her back on the next stage, you wait. Woman like that on a mountain ranch. She won't last the first cold snap. Mabel did not turn around. Caleb didn't either. He led the way to the wagon. The ride up the mountain took nearly 2 hours on roads that were more suggestion than fact at that time of year. The cold deepened as they climbed. The pines grew taller and darker and more closely packed. The wagon creaked and lurched over frozen ruts, and Caleb kept his eyes on the trail and said almost nothing. Mabel sat beside him and did not seem to feel the need to fill the silence. This surprised him. In his limited experience of women, which was limited indeed, they tended to talk when made uncomfortable. The ride up his mountain made most people uncomfortable. She watched the tree line with what looked like genuine interest. Halfway up, she said, "What's at the eastern edge of that ridge?" He looked where she was looking. Neighbor's fence line, family named Gruber. They run cattle. How many head? He glanced at her sideways. Maybe 60. Last count. Why? Curious about the land, she said. I like to understand the shape of a place. He returned his eyes to the trail. The shape of a place. He had lived here 19 years and had never put it that way. The cabin's small, he said. It felt important that she know this before she saw it. One main room, kitchen attached, separate storage shed. The barn's in better shape than the house, if I'm being honest. Most ranches are, she said. He couldn't argue with that. There's a loft, he added. I built a partition, for privacy. She looked at him then, and he kept his eyes forward. I appreciate that, she said. When they arrived at the cabin, the last of the afternoon light was fading fast, and the temperature had dropped to something that bit through wool like it wasn't there. The cabin sat at the edge of a cleared stretch of land, backed against a stand of spruce trees that blocked the worst of the northern wind. It was rough-hewn, low-roofed, and cold-looking even from the outside. The front step was missing a board. A rusted tin bucket sat beside the door with no apparent purpose. Caleb jumped down and went to unload her bag. Mabel stepped down herself, without waiting, and stood looking at the cabin for a moment. The step needs fixing, she said. I know. Before the next ice, she said. It was not a request, it was not a complaint. It was simply a fact delivered with the quiet certainty of someone who had already calculated the problem and its solution. He looked at her. All right. She went inside. The interior of the cabin was exactly as she'd expected from everything she hadn't been told. A fireplace that needed cleaning. A rough table and 2 chairs, one of them slightly shorter than the other, which meant someone had replaced a leg at some point and measured wrong. A shelf with 4 tins of food, beans, 2 of them, something that used to be peaches, and something she couldn't identify. A single wool blanket folded on a wooden trunk. A smell of wood smoke and cold stone, and something like loneliness, though she wouldn't have said that aloud. She set her crate down on the table. How long since you had a proper winter store? She asked. He was standing in the doorway, still holding her bag. Last fall I traded a cord of wood for supplies from Gruber. Made it through. Made it through and prepared are different things, she said. He said nothing. She opened her crate. He watched, not moving, as she began laying things on the table. Small cloth bags with contents she had packed and labeled herself. A bundle of dried herbs. A wrapped piece of cured pork, the good kind, from a hog slaughtered right and smoked long. A tin of cooking grease. A small glass bottle of something dark. 2 folded papers that looked like documents of some kind. What are those? He asked, nodding at the papers. Receipts, she said, from the agency. And a record of what I know, skills. What I've managed, what I've preserved, what I've built. She folded them again and set them aside. I learned a long time ago that a woman who walks into a new situation without a record of herself is a woman who can be told she has nothing to offer. He put the bag down near the trunk. He didn't know what to say to that. I was not a man accustomed to women who talked about themselves as strategic problems to be solved. Have you eaten? He asked. On the stage, hours ago. I can... He stopped. He could not, in good conscience, call what he did in the kitchen cooking. "There's beans," he said. She looked at him. "There's the pork I brought," she said. "And if you have an onion and any salt worth the name, I can make something that'll take the cold out of your bones by the time the fire's built up." He had half an onion. He had salt. He told her so. "Good," she said, and rolled up her sleeves. He ate more that night than he'd eaten at a single sitting in longer than he could account for. She didn't make it fancy. That wasn't the point. She made it right. The pork sliced thin and cooked down in its own fat, the onion going in when the pan was hot enough to make it sing, salt added twice, once early and once late, in a way that produced a depth of flavor from nearly nothing. She made a pan bread from flour she'd brought, which was dense and slightly charred on the bottom and absolutely correct for a night that cold. He ate. He didn't say thank you right away. He wasn't a man who said things easily. When he finally set down his fork, he said, "That was a good meal." "It was a serviceable meal," she said. "When I have a proper store to work with, I'll show you what a good meal is." He looked at her across the table. The fire had gotten itself going, and the cabin was, for the first time in weeks, genuinely warm. She had done something to the room simply by being in it. A straightening, a purposefulness, as if the space had been waiting for someone who knew how to inhabit it. "Why did you come?" he asked. He hadn't intended to ask it. It arrived on its own. She didn't seem surprised by the question. She thought for a moment, weighing her answer the way she had weighed the salt, deliberately, without rushing. "I'm 34 years old," she said. "I have skills that keep a household running through hard seasons. I have patience that most people mistake for meekness. I have a mind that doesn't stop working even when I keep my mouth shut." She looked at him steadily. "The city doesn't value any of that in a woman my size. I decided to go somewhere that might." He sat with that. "And this," she added, with a small flat gesture that took in the cabin and the mountain and probably him, "looked like somewhere that needed what I have." He nodded. He didn't have a response to that, but the nod was genuine. Outside, the wind had picked up. It moved through the spruce trees with a sound like water running fast over stone. The fire crackled and settled. The single lantern on the table put a warm oval of light between them. "The townspeople," he said. "What they said. When you arrived." "I heard it," she said. "I'm sorry for it." "You didn't say it." "I stood there while they did," he said. This cost him something. He could feel it costing. She looked at him for a moment, really looked, the way she had on the street, that direct and calibrating attention. "You walked toward me," she said finally. "Plenty of men wouldn't have." He didn't know what to do with that either. The first week was not easy. This needs to be said plainly, because there is a version of this story that wants to soften those early days, to make the partnership between two strangers something that bloomed gently and without friction, like the first shoots of a spring garden. That is not what happened. Caleb Whitaker had been alone for a long time, not just alone in the physical sense, though he had been that emphatically, but alone in the deeper way that hardens a person without their noticing, that makes the rhythms of solitude feel more natural than the friction of shared space. He had habits he didn't know were habits until someone else was there to disrupt them. He kept his tools in a particular arrangement on the workbench. He woke at a specific hour, and he expected the morning to proceed in a specific order. He did not talk at meals. Mabel did not talk at meals either, as it happened, but she moved differently than he moved. She reorganized the kitchen shelf, not drastically, but purposefully, in a way that made logical sense and that he nevertheless had to stop himself from rearranging back. She asked questions about the ranch that he wasn't used to being asked. What was the load-bearing capacity of the storage shed? Had the south fence been checked since the first frost? Was the well on the property line or his outright? "The well is mine," he said, on the third morning when she asked about it. "Dug it myself 12 years back." "Has anyone ever contested it?" "Gruber tried once, 8 years ago." He paused. "Didn't go anywhere." She nodded, writing something in a small notebook she kept on the kitchen shelf. He looked at the notebook but didn't ask about it. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. What he noticed, by the end of the first week, was that the cabin was warmer. Not metaphorically, literally warmer. She had found 2 gaps in the chinking between the logs near the northeast corner and filled them with a mixture of mud and dry grass that she'd prepared outside and applied efficiently. He had known about one of those gaps. He had not known about the other. He also noticed that the food situation looked different. She had taken inventory of what they had, written it down in the notebook, and reorganized the storage so that what would spoil first was accessible first. She had started a small drying rack near the fireplace for herbs she'd gathered on a walk she'd taken. A walk he hadn't known she was taking, which startled him when he came in from the barn and found her gone. "Where did you go?" he asked when she came back. "Down the east slope about half a mile. There's a creek that doesn't freeze until deep winter, and the south bank still has rosehip and yarrow. I brought back what I could carry." She showed him the bundle. "You went alone," he said, "down the slope, without telling me." "I'm 34 years old," she said. "I don't require an escort to take a walk." "On this mountain you might." She looked at him. "What's on the east slope that should concern me?" He opened his mouth. He closed it. The honest answer was that there was nothing particularly dangerous on the east slope at this time of year. The weather had been cold but stable, and there hadn't been a significant predator sighting in weeks. His concern was less about the east slope and more about the feeling he'd had when he came inside and she wasn't there. A feeling he didn't like and didn't know what to call. "Tell me next time," he said. "That's all." She studied him. "All right," she said. "I'll tell you next time." She had told him she was practical, and she was, in ways that continually surprised him. The day she stitched a tear in the leather harness he'd been working around for 2 months, using a curved needle from a kit in her crate and a technique he'd never seen applied to harness work, he stood in the barn doorway and watched her hands move and said nothing. When she finished, she pulled the stitching taut, tested the tension, and handed it back. "I did some harness work for a livery stable in Cincinnati for 3 years," she said, reading his expression. "In between other things." "Between what other things?" "Cook at a boarding house, housekeeper for a doctor's family, some laundry work when those didn't come through." She said it without bitterness and without apology. "I kept myself." She had kept herself. He turned that phrase over. "You weren't—" He stopped, unsure how to say it. "Married before?" she said. "No, I was spoken for once. He decided my size was a problem." She met his eyes when she said it. She did not look wounded. She looked like someone reporting a weather fact, something that had happened, not something that defined her. He nodded. He didn't say anything about it. He thought she would have disliked platitudes. He turned the harness over in his hands, examining her stitching. It was better than anything he could have done. "Thank you," he said. "It needed doing," she said, which is how she responded to most thanks. Not dismissively, just accurately. The gossip from Harlan's Crossing reached the mountain in the way gossip always does. In pieces, from different directions, adding up to a picture over time. Caleb went down to the settlement twice in the first 2 weeks. Once for grain, once for a replacement bolt for the barn gate. And both times he heard things. Women talking in the general store. Men making remarks at the feed post. The core of it was always the same. The mail-order bride hadn't left yet, which was surprising, and this fact needed explaining in a way that didn't require revising anyone's opinion of her. The explanations that were circulating, she was too proud to admit she'd made a mistake. She had nowhere else to go. Caleb was too polite to send her back. He didn't respond to any of it. He got what he needed and went home. When he told Mabel, and he found himself telling her, which surprised him because he was not a man who reported information readily, she listened without her expression changing. "Do they know you're coming down before you arrive?" she asked. "Usually, word travels." "Then they're saying these things knowing you'll hear them," she said. He hadn't considered that angle. "Maybe." "People who need you to know they're talking about you aren't just gossiping," she said. "They're telling you something about what they think of themselves." She went back to what she was doing, shelling dried beans into a pot, a task she had been performing with one hand while listening to him with the other. "Don't worry about it." "I'm not worried," he said, slightly faster than was convincing. She didn't smile exactly, but something shifted in her face. The Gruber family arrived on a Saturday toward the end of the second week, unannounced, the way neighboring families in remote settlements sometimes did, appearing at the top of the lane with their wagon before anyone in the cabin knew they were coming. There were 4 of them. Herschel Gruber, who ran the cattle operation on the adjacent land and was approximately Caleb's age. His wife Alma, who was slight and spoke rarely but had eyes that caught everything. Their son Henrik, who was 19 and built like a fence post. and Henrik's wife Britta, who was pregnant with their first child, and walking with the careful deliberateness of someone in her 7th month. Caleb saw them from the barn and had just enough time to be aware that there was nothing he could do about the situation before they were at the cabin door. He went inside ahead of them to find Mabel already at the fireplace, already aware. She had heard the wagon on the frozen road and had been expecting company. She had put the kettle on. She was wiping her hands on a cloth and turning toward the door as the Grubers knocked. She opened the door herself. Alma Gruber looked at her. There was a moment, not long but real, where Alma's eyes did what most people's eyes did in those first seconds with Mabel. They registered, assessed, and arrived at a conclusion. But Alma was not Dorothy Reeves. The conclusion she arrived at was less certain than Dorothy's had been. There was something in Mabel's face that complicated easy judgments. "We brought a pie," Alma said, holding out a wrapped tin. "Dried apple. We heard Caleb had a bride come in and thought we'd come say hello properly." "That's kind," Mabel said. She stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in from the cold. I've got water heating." They came in. The cabin by this point was visibly different from what Caleb knew they would have expected. It was still small and rough, but it was ordered. The kitchen shelf made sense. The fireplace radiated effectively rather than sporadically. There was a braid of dried herbs hanging above the window. The table was clean. The smell of the place had changed entirely from the cold bachelor smoke of before. Herschel Gruber took it in and said nothing, but his eyes moved across the room with recognition. The recognition of someone who understood work. They sat around the table. Mabel made coffee with what she had and served the apple pie alongside it. Henrik ate 2 slices before his wife could stop him. Britta Gruber sat beside Mabel and talked quietly about the baby. The timing, the positioning, the fear that it would come during a storm. Mabel listened the way she always listened, with full attention and without filling the space with her own voice. "Are you familiar with births?" Britta asked her. "I've been present at 3, Mabel said. On a farm family I worked for in Ohio, and once at the boarding house. I'm not a midwife, but I know what I know." Britta looked at her with the naked gratitude of a young woman who was very far from her mother. "Our nearest midwife is 6 miles down the mountain," she said. "I know," Mabel said. "I've already mapped the distances." She said it matter-of-factly, not as reassurance, but it functioned as reassurance. After they left, Caleb cleared the cups and said, "You've mapped the distances." "I like to know what's around me," Mabel said. "You've been here 2 weeks." "That's long enough," she said. That night, after the fire had settled and the lamp had been turned low, Caleb sat at the table with the account book he kept for the ranch. He went through the columns the way he always did: feed costs, fence material, the loss of 2 ewes in the previous winter. And then he stopped. He sat with the book open and the pencil in his hand, and he thought about the Gruber visit. He thought about how the cabin had felt with people in it. Not crowded, the way he'd braced for. Full. There was a difference. He thought about what Herschel Gruber had said to him privately, near the wagon, just before they left. "Your wife," Herschel had said. And it was the first time anyone had called her that, and it had landed with a strange weight. She's the kind of woman you don't find often, the kind that actually knows how to do things. Caleb had said, "I know." He sat with the pencil. He could hear very faintly the sound of Mabel in the loft, the settling of weight on the boards, the small specific sounds of someone settling in for the night. He had spent 19 years listening to nothing up there. The sounds she made were not intrusive. They were just present. They filled a silence he had gotten so used to that he'd stopped hearing it. He wrote 2 numbers in the account book. He closed it. He went to bed. Outside, the mountain held the cold the way it always did, without mercy, without promise, without any particular interest in the people living on its slopes. The winter was coming. Not the front edge of cold they'd had so far, but the real thing, the kind that came down from the north and stayed for months and tested everything. Mabel Hartwell had been on this mountain for 2 weeks. She had patched the chinking. She had fixed the harness. She had fed him meals that made the winter seem survivable. She had opened the door to neighbors he'd been too closed off to properly welcome himself. She had mapped the distances. She had not left. Caleb lay in the dark and thought, the townspeople are going to be wrong about this. He did not yet know how wrong. He did not yet know what was coming, the storms, the failures, the moments that would strip everything down to its essential truth. He only knew, in the particular way that a man who has spent a long time alone begins to know things again when the world brings someone into his silence, that the woman upstairs was not what anyone had decided she was. She was something else entirely. And the mountain, for the first time in 19 years, felt like it was waiting to find out what. The cold that settled into the mountain in the third week of Mabel's arrival was a different thing entirely from the cold that had greeted her when she stepped off the stagecoach. That first cold had been sharp and unwelcoming, the kind that bites at exposed skin and makes the eyes water. This new cold was quieter, heavier. It pressed down on the cabin roof and moved through the trees without sound. And when Caleb woke at 5 in the morning and looked at the thermometer nailed to the exterior wall beside the door, the reading made him stand still for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. He went inside and built the fire without waking her. That was the arrangement they had arrived at without discussing it. He handled the fire in the mornings, she handled the kitchen once it was warm enough to work in. Neither of them had proposed this arrangement. It had simply organized itself over the course of 2 weeks, the way practical things do between practical people when they are paying attention. He heard her moving in the loft when the fire had been going for 20 minutes. The board shifted. There were the small sounds of a person dressing in the cold. Then her feet on the ladder rungs. She came down already wearing her heaviest shawl over her dress, her hair pinned but not yet properly, and she looked at the thermometer reading on the table. He'd written it down on the margin of a scrap of paper, a habit he'd developed years ago. And she said, "That's the real start of it." "Looks like it," he said. "How are the animals?" "Haven't been out yet. Wanted to get the fire going first." She nodded. She was already at the kitchen shelf, already calculating. He watched her eyes move across the inventory she had posted on the inside of the shelf door, a list in her precise, slightly angular handwriting that detailed what they had, in what quantities, and roughly how long it would last at current consumption. She had updated it every 3 days without being asked. "We're going to need to think about the Grubers," she said. He looked at her. "The Grubers?" "Britta is close to her time. If the road from here to their place gets bad enough, it gets bad fast. And their nearest midwife is 6 miles down, and 6 miles is twice as far when the snow is wrong." She moved 2 tins to the front of the shelf. "I'm not saying anything is certain. I'm saying I'd like to know what we have and what we could spare." He hadn't thought about the Grubers in those terms. He thought about them occasionally as neighbors. Men thought about neighbors in terms of fence lines and borrowed equipment and the approximate distance between properties. Mabel thought about them the way a person thinks about a situation that hasn't become a problem yet, but will. "You planning on delivering that baby yourself?" he asked, and he didn't mean it as a challenge, more as a genuine effort to understand the scope of what she was thinking. "I'm planning on being ready if I have to," she said. "There's a difference." He drank his coffee. She made breakfast, oats with a scrape of the cured pork fat for richness, which shouldn't have been as good as it was. Outside, the wind started to organize itself against the north wall. He could hear the particular note it made when the temperature was in a certain range, lower than usual, more sustained, like something that intended to stay. He spent that morning in the barn, which was his habit when the weather was coming in, and there was nothing on the ranch that required him to be elsewhere. The animals needed checking, the straw needed turning in 2 of the stalls, and the south wall of the barn had developed a lean over the summer that he'd been watching with the cautious attention of a man who knew a problem was developing but hadn't yet decided it required action. It required action. He was bracing the wall with the length of timber when he heard the cabin door open and close. He looked through the barn window, a gap in the boards more than a window really, but functional, and saw Mabel crossing the yard towards the storage shed. She had the notebook with her. He watched her go into the shed and stayed watching long enough to see her come out 5 minutes later with a particular look on her face, focused, slightly tight around the eyes, that he was beginning to recognize as the expression she wore when she had discovered something that confirmed a worry she'd already had. She came into the barn. "The shed roof," she said. "What about it?" "There's a section over the east end where the snow load is accumulating wrong. The pitch is too shallow on that side. If we get a heavy fall on top of what's already there—" She stopped. She didn't finish the sentence because she didn't need to. A shed roof that failed under snow load was not a complicated consequence to imagine. "I'll look at it," he said. "I already looked at it," she said. "I'm telling you what I found." He put down the timber. He went with her. She was right. The east end of the shed roof had a section, about 4 feet across, where the boards had warped over the summer and dried in a configuration that collected rather than shed snow. The accumulation on that section was noticeably deeper than on the rest of the roof, and the center of that section had a very faint bow to it that might have been there for years or might have appeared in the last week. "We can fix this," he said, looking up at it. "I know we can fix it," she said. "I want to know when." "Today," he said. "Good," she said. He spent the afternoon on the shed roof with a pole clearing the immediate snow load while Mabel went through the interior and shifted the most critical supplies, the salt, the dried beans, the smoked meat, to the end of the shed that was structurally sound. He didn't ask her to do this. She did it because it was the logical precaution while he worked on the roof, and because Mabel Hartwell did not sit inside waiting to see if the precaution would be necessary before taking it. He fixed the section. It was not elegant work. He didn't have the right materials for a proper repair, and the cold made everything harder. But it held. He came down from the roof with numb hands and found her standing in the shed doorway watching him. "It'll last the winter," he said. "I'll do it properly in the spring." "Doesn't need to be pretty," she said. "Just needs to hold." He looked at her. "You sound like me." "Practical people sound like each other," she said, and went back inside. The invitation came from Harlan's Crossing 4 days later. It arrived in the form of a note delivered by the Gruber boy. Henrik had ridden down for supplies and brought it back as a favor to whoever had sent it. And it was from Eleanor Hoyt, who ran the settlement's only proper social organization, a monthly gathering. She called a community supper, but which functioned primarily as an opportunity for the women of Harlan's Crossing to organize the social landscape of the settlement according to their preferences. The note was addressed to Mrs. Whitaker, which was the first time Mabel had received anything addressed that way, and she read it at the table while Caleb watched her face for information. "They want us to come to the community supper," she said. "Saturday, at the Hoyt house." "Eleanor Hoyt's suppers are not entirely voluntary," Caleb said carefully. "She says as much in the note," Mabel said. She put it down. "She says all members of the Harlan's Crossing community are expected to participate in maintaining the bonds of neighborly fellowship." "She writes like that," he said. "She means it too." Mabel looked at the note for another moment. "Is Dorothy Reeves part of this gathering?" He hesitated. "Dorothy's husband is on the settlement council, so yes." Mabel nodded once. "All right," she said. "You don't have to." "I didn't say I didn't want to go," she said. "I said all right." He looked at her. "I've dealt with Dorothy Reeves before," Mabel said. "Not her specifically, but her kind. Specifically. Many times." She folded the note and set it on the shelf. "A woman like that is only powerful in a room where everyone agrees to pretend she is. I don't agree easily." He thought about this for a long moment. "What do you want to bring?" he asked. "What do people usually bring?" "Something baked or preserved. Eleanor keeps a record of it, unofficially." "Of course she does," Mabel said. She went to the kitchen shelf and looked at her inventory. "I'll make something worth bringing." She made 2 things. The first was a preserved apple butter she produced from the dried apples she'd brought in her crate, combined with the small store of late apples Caleb had in the cellar, cooked down over 2 days on the fireplace in a process that required attention at specific intervals, and produced a result that smelled extraordinary and tasted, Caleb discovered when she gave him a spoonful to evaluate, like everything good about autumn compressed into something that could be spread on bread. The second was a spiced hard cheese, not made from scratch, since she didn't have the time or materials for that, but achieved by treating a block of the plain salt cheese she'd found in the cellar with a rub of dried herbs and pressing it under weight for 2 days in a cloth. A technique she said she'd learned from a German woman at the boarding house who had told her that good cheese was 70% patience. He tasted the cheese, too, when she presented it. "This is from our cellar?" he said. "From your cellar," she said. "Same cheese, different treatment?" He shook his head slightly. He was not a man given to expressions of wonder, but something moved across his face that was in the vicinity of it. The Hoyt house was the largest structure in Harlan's Crossing, which was not saying a great deal, but was enough to accommodate 15 people around 2 pushed-together tables. When Caleb and Mabel arrived, on time, which was, Caleb knew, itself a kind of statement, most of the settlement families were already there. The room quieted when they walked in. Not completely, not rudely, but there was a shift, a slight recalibration of conversations, a new direction to certain pairs of eyes, that both of them felt and neither acknowledged. Eleanor Hoyt came forward to greet them. She was a tall, angular woman of about 50 with the manner of someone accustomed to making rooms work the way she wanted them to. She looked at Mabel with the same assessing attention that Alma Gruber had shown, but more deliberate. "Mrs. Whitaker," she said, "we're glad you could come." "Thank you for the invitation," Mabel said. She handed over the apple butter and the cheese wrapped neatly in cloth. "I brought these." Eleanor unwrapped them. Something shifted in her expression, not warmly, exactly, but with a kind of involuntary respect that expensive-looking work produces in people who understand expensive-looking work. "This is lovely," she said, and there was enough genuine surprise in it to be almost rude. "It's practical," Mabel said. "Keeps well." Dorothy Reeves was on the far side of the room. Caleb saw her see them. He watched her say something to the woman beside her, Margaret Foss, whose husband had the livery. And Margaret looked up and then looked away. He felt something tighten in his chest that was not quite anger, but was in the same building. Mabel had not looked at Dorothy yet. She was talking to Eleanor about the apple butter, the process, the timing, the ratio of spice, in a calm and specific way that had already pulled two other women in to listen, not because Mabel was performing, because she was actually saying something worth knowing. He found a position near the wall and watched. Dinner was a collective affair, with each family's contribution arranged along the center of the tables. What Mabel had brought was better than most of it. He could see people tasting the apple butter and responding to it, that particular involuntary expression of the face when something is genuinely good and you weren't expecting it to be. He saw Dorothy taste it. He saw her expression. He watched her speak to her husband without looking at Mabel. He also watched Britta Gruber find Mabel at the edge of the room and speak to her quietly and at length. Mabel listened and occasionally asked questions, precise, practical questions about timing and positioning and what Britta felt when. Britta was holding both of Mabel's hands by the time the conversation was done, which was a thing that happened, Caleb observed, when you made a frightened person feel like someone was actually listening to their fear. The evening proceeded. No confrontation happened. This was in some ways more unsettling than confrontation would have been, because what happened instead was subtler and more complicated, a slow, reluctant revision. He could see it happening in the room. Could see the moments when women who had made up their minds about Mabel were forced to update the file, as it were. Mabel answering a question about winter food storage with specifics that nobody else in the room could match. Mabel helping Eleanor's younger daughter with a problem she'd been having with the heel of a knitted sock. Mabel saying to Herschel Gruber, directly and without embarrassment, that the lean she'd noticed in his second fence post from the road. When they drove past it this evening, looked like a heaved frost problem, and he might want to reset it before the ground froze harder. Herschel Gruber looked at her. "I noticed that post last week," he said. "Didn't say anything." "I noticed it tonight," Mabel said. "Caleb didn't." Caleb, hearing this, looked at the post in his memory and realized she was right. Dorothy Reeves found her way to Mabel at the end of the evening, near the door, when people were collecting their wraps, and the gathering was breaking up into smaller conversations and preparations for the cold ride home. Caleb was 3 feet away, talking to Herschel about the frost-heaved fence post. He was close enough to hear. "Mrs. Whitaker," Dorothy said. Her tone was particular, pitched at a register that could pass for warmth at a distance but wasn't, up close. Mabel turned. "Mrs. Reeves." "The apple butter was very fine," Dorothy said. "I was surprised." "Were you?" Mabel said. It was not a question. Dorothy's smile stayed in place with some effort. "I mean only that you traveled so far. It's impressive to have produced something of that quality in a new home." "I've been producing things of that quality for 20 years, Mabel said pleasantly. "The home is new. The skills aren't." There was a pause. Dorothy's smile thinned slightly. "Still, the mountain it must be quite a change for someone from, where was it you came from?" "Cincinnati," Mabel said. "Cincinnati," Dorothy repeated with a faint, deliberate emphasis that somehow made the city sound inadequate. "A very different kind of place." "It is," Mabel agreed. "More people, less honesty." She said it without heat, the way she said most things. As a fact, delivered at normal volume, with no particular malice and no particular softness. I find I prefer the mountain. Dorothy looked at her for a moment. Well, Dorothy said. Good evening, Mrs. Reeves, Mabel said, and turned back to pulling on her coat. Caleb had stopped talking to Herschel. Herschel was pretending not to have heard any of it, which meant he had heard all of it. On the ride home up the dark mountain road, with the cold pressing in from all sides and the horse moving carefully on the frozen surface, Caleb said, More people, less honesty. It's true, Mabel said. I know it's true, he said. He stopped. You didn't think I'd say it, she said. I didn't know what you'd say, he said honestly. I've been watching you all evening, and I still couldn't tell you what you're going to do next. She was quiet for a moment. The horse's breath came in white puffs in the lamplight. Is that a problem? She asked. No, he said, and then, it's just new. She said nothing to that, but he felt something ease slightly in the air between them, some tension he hadn't realized was there, letting go a little, the way cold sometimes does when it shifts into the particular stage just before snow. Snow came the following Tuesday. Not the first snow. They'd had dusting since October, the kind that coated the ground and disappeared by noon. This was different. This was the snow that came to stay. Caleb woke to 8 inches and a sky that was still producing, steadily and without apology. He did the animals while Mabel built the fire to a size that would hold all morning. When he came back in, stamping his boots, she had already been to the storage shed and back. He could see the fresh marks in the new snow, and she was writing in her notebook at the table. Something wrong? He asked. Recalculating, she said. If we get another 8 inches on top of this before it stops, which that sky looks like it intends to do, we'll want to make sure the load on the shed roof is managed. I fixed the shed roof. You fixed the weak section, she said. A heavy enough load everywhere is still a heavy load everywhere. He stood at the door looking out at the snow. She was right, technically. A fix on a specific weakness didn't change the fundamental load-bearing situation if the snowfall was extreme enough. He thought about the repairs he'd done last fall, the ones he'd told himself were good enough, the ones that had seemed fine in the dry, frozen weeks before Mabel arrived, and started asking questions about structural capacity. How much do you weigh? She asked suddenly. He turned around. What? She was looking at him with complete seriousness. Approximately. I need to know the load we can walk on the shed roof to clear it. Too much weight in the wrong place while we're clearing is its own problem. He told her. She wrote it down. She told him hers, plainly, without hesitation, with no more self-consciousness than if she were telling him the weight of a sack of grain. The matter-of-fact quality of it landed on him in a way he didn't immediately understand. He'd been around women his whole life who would sooner have told him their deepest secret than their weight. Mabel told him because it was a relevant variable in a structural calculation. He went back out into the snow with a long pole to start clearing the shed roof. She followed 20 minutes later to help. They worked in silence mostly, which was their way. But it was a different silence than the ones from the early days. Less careful, less managed. More like the silence of two people who have stopped spending energy on performing normalcy and can just exist in the same space. At one point she slipped on the shed roof. Her boot found a patch of ice under the snow and her foot went sideways. And he grabbed her arm, hard and fast, without thinking. She steadied. He kept hold of her arm for 1 second longer than was strictly necessary. Thank you, she said. Watch the ice, he said, letting go. I didn't know it was there, she said, which was as close as she got to explaining why she'd slipped, not defending herself, just noting the fact. Now you do, he said. She continued working. The snow kept coming, 3 more inches by nightfall, another 4 overnight. When Caleb went out the second morning, the drifts against the north side of the cabin had reached the base of the single window on that wall. The road down to Harlan's Crossing was invisible. The Gruber place was somewhere to the east under a white that made the distances feel different, extended, uncertain, untrustworthy. He was thinking about the Grubers when, mid-morning, Henrik Gruber appeared at the top of their lane on horseback, moving fast. Caleb saw him from the barn and came out. Henrik's face, when he got close enough to read, was tight with the particular expression of a young man trying to be calm about something he was not calm about. It's Britta, he said, before he'd fully pulled up. The baby's coming. It's early. My mother says it's too early. Caleb had the horse's bridle in his hand. He looked at the boy's face. How early? 3 weeks, maybe 4. It started last night, and it won't. It's not stopping, but it's also not. Henrik stopped himself. He was 29 years old, and his wife was in pain, and he had ridden through 2 feet of snow to get here because there was no one else to go to. Caleb turned toward the cabin. Mabel, he said, not quite shouting. She was already at the door. She had heard the horse. She looked at Henrik. Henrik told her what he'd told Caleb. She went back inside. She was out again in less than 3 minutes, dressed in her heaviest coat with her scarf and gloves and carrying a bag that Caleb had not seen before. A different bag from the travel bag, a compact square thing that she had apparently packed at some previous point in preparation for this specific eventuality. She had packed a bag. He looked at her. I told you I like to be ready, she said. He got the horses. Henrik hadn't waited. He'd turned back the moment Mabel was moving, understanding that the fastest thing he could do now was get out of the way and ride ahead. Caleb went with Mabel. The snow made the ride to the Gruber's place take 30 minutes instead of the usual 12, and they didn't talk on the way, concentrating on the horse's footing and the road that kept trying to disappear under them. The Gruber cabin was warmer than Caleb's, larger, with more people in it. Alma Gruber met them at the door with the expression of a woman who has been managing a frightening situation for hours and is nearly at the limit of management. She's in the back room, Alma said. To Caleb, you stay out here. To Mabel, thank the Lord you came. Mabel nodded and went in. Caleb stayed in the main room with Herschel and Henrik and a fire that nobody was tending properly. He added wood to it. He drank the coffee Herschel poured without tasting it. He listened to the sounds from the back room. Britta's voice, which was doing the thing a person's voice does in real pain, not controlled or composed, just raw. And Alma's lower voice responding, and then, clearly, Mabel's voice, which was at a particular frequency and pace that he recognized as her problem-solving register, the one she used when she was working through something that required precision and calm. Henrik sat on a chair near the wall with his hands between his knees. She knows what she's doing, Caleb said. Henrik looked at him. Mabel, Caleb said. She's done this before. She knows what she's doing. It wasn't entirely certain, what he said. He didn't know the full extent of what Mabel could handle in this situation. But he had watched her for nearly 3 weeks now, watched her calculate and prepare and steady herself in moments that would have scattered a less rooted person. And the certainty he expressed was not false. It was just slightly ahead of the evidence. Henrik nodded. They waited. It took 4 hours. Near the end of the first hour, Alma came out for more water and told them, without quite meeting anyone's eyes, that Mabel had taken control in a way that had made things clearer. Near the end of the second hour, the sounds from the back room changed quality. Still difficult, but differently difficult, if that could be said. Near the end of the third hour, Caleb heard Mabel's voice say something in a specific tone, and then a silence that was long enough to be frightening, and then a sound that was not silence at all. Henrik stood up. The baby cried. Thinly, initially, and then with more commitment. The way something does when it has just arrived in the world and discovered that the world is cold and loud, and nothing like what preceded it. Alma came out of the back room with her hand over her mouth and tears running freely down her face and said, "A boy. They're all right." Henrik made a sound that was not language. Caleb sat with the relief of it, which was larger than he'd expected. He hadn't thought he was as worried as he'd been. He found that he'd been very worried. He looked at the closed door of the back room. He thought about Mabel in there, the bag she had packed in anticipation of exactly this, the way she had walked in without apparent fear. The ride back was longer and colder than the ride there because the afternoon had used up whatever relative warmth the day had offered. The horses moved carefully through snow that had been softened slightly by the midday and then frozen again by the early dark, which made the surface unpredictable. Sometimes solid, sometimes yielding, requiring constant attention. They rode close because the trail required it. Their shoulders were almost touching. "You packed that bag before Britta was even close to her time," he said. Not accusing, observing. "I packed it 2 days after I arrived," she said. He looked at her. In the failing light, her face was difficult to read, but he could see her breath in the air and the set of her jaw, which was not tight, more settled, like someone who has done a thing they prepared to do and found the preparation was enough. "Why?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. The horses moved. "Because I looked at her at the Gruber's visit and I thought, this girl is scared and she is far from anyone who knows her. And I thought, someone should be ready." She paused. "I'm usually the someone." He had nothing to say to that, not because there was nothing to say, but because the things that existed in him to say were large enough and unfamiliar enough that he needed more time before they could become words. They rode the rest of the way without talking. The cabin appeared through the trees, a dark shape with no light yet because neither of them had been there to light it. He got the horses stabled while she went inside and got the fire going, and when he came in from the barn, the cabin was already warming and there was a lamp on the table and she was standing at the kitchen shelf looking at her inventory list. "We're short on salt," she said. "I know," he said. "We'll need to get more before the road gets any worse." "I'll go down tomorrow if it's passable," he said. She nodded. She was very tired. He could see it, the way she was holding herself up with something that was will rather than actual energy. But she was already solving the next problem. "Mabel," he said. She turned. "Sit down," he said. "The salt will wait until tomorrow. Sit down." She looked at him. It was a long look, the kind she gave things she was evaluating seriously. Then she sat. He made the coffee. Badly. Worse than she made it. The same as he'd been making it for 20 years. And put it in front of her and sat across from her. The fire built itself up. The lamp held. Outside, the mountain held all its cold and snow and dark and distance, entirely indifferent to the people sitting at the table inside this small, patched together, increasingly warm cabin. "You did a good thing today," he said. "I did what I knew how to do," she said. "That is what a good thing is," he said. She looked at her coffee. He could not see her expression fully in the light, but her hand on the cup was still, and she did not argue with him, which for Mabel Hartwell was a kind of agreement. They sat in the quiet of it. The fire cracked. The wind moved through the spruce trees with that sound like running water. Somewhere down the eastern slope, in the Gruber cabin, a new person was breathing for the first time, and the woman across from him had helped bring that about, with a bag she'd packed 2 days after arriving on a mountain where nobody had expected her to last the first cold snap. The mountain was still the mountain. The winter was still the winter. But Caleb Whitaker was finding, to something that felt like his own surprise and something else's inevitability, that the cabin he'd built with his hands and lived in alone for 19 years had changed in a way he could not have anticipated and was no longer sure he would want to undo. The salt ran out on a Thursday. Not completely. There was still enough for cooking, enough to keep things functional at the most basic level, but the working supply that Mabel used for preservation was down to what she could hold in 2 cupped hands, and she stood at the kitchen shelf that Thursday morning, looking at it with the expression Caleb had learned to read as her version of alarm, which looked on anyone else like concentration. He had not made it down the mountain to get more. The road had been passable for 2 days after the Gruber baby arrived, and then the snow had come back in a way that was not dramatic but was thorough. Not the heavy falling kind, but the kind that packed itself into the road ruts and froze there overnight, turning the downhill slope into something a horse could navigate only at a pace that made a 4-hour round trip into something closer to 7. He had meant to go. He had been fixing the fence on the south side where a post had split under the ice load, and then he had been dealing with one of the ewes who had gone off her feed, and then the road had gotten worse again. "I'll go today," he said. "The road's not good enough for the wagon," she said. "I'll take the horse." She looked at him. "You can carry enough salt on a horse for what we need?" "I can carry what I can carry," he said. "It'll get us through another week, and maybe by then the road will be manageable." She turned back to the shelf. She moved a tin. She moved it back. "I should have asked for more 2 weeks ago," she said. "I should have gone 2 weeks ago," he said. A pause. "Yes," she said. "But I knew the inventory better than you did. I should have said something earlier." This was something he had noticed about her. She distributed fault evenly when fault was distributed, including to herself, without drama and without resentment. It was not a quality he had expected from anyone, and it continued to surprise him. "I'll leave in an hour," he said. He came back from Harlan's Crossing 4 hours later with salt, and two other things he had not planned to bring home. The first was news. The second was the weight of it. He came into the cabin and set the salt on the kitchen shelf without a word. Mabel was at the fireplace turning something in the pot. She looked at him and saw his face. "What happened?" she said. It was not a question. He took off his coat and hung it. He sat down at the table. She waited. "There's a man in town," he said. "Been there about a week, apparently. Staying at the Mercer lodging house. Goes by the name of Aldous Crane." He said the name the way people say names they've just learned and don't yet know what to do with. "He's been talking to people. To the council, specifically. To Reeves." Mabel had turned fully from the fireplace. "What kind of talking?" "The kind about land," he said. "About the mountain claims. About whether certain homestead papers are—" He stopped. He pressed his fingers flat on the table. "He's representing a company out of Denver. A land development company. He's been telling people there are irregularities in some of the upper mountain claims. That the original filings may have problems." The fire popped. Outside, the wind moved. "Your filing," Mabel said. "Mine's not the only one. Gruber's upper pasture, the Holloway property further west, but mine is—" He stopped again. He was not a man who found it easy to say certain kinds of things. "My original filing was done in '62, before the territory standardized its registration. There was a period where certain claims needed to be re-registered, and I filed the re-registration, but there was a question at the time about whether the surveyor's description matched the original. I thought it was resolved." "Was it resolved in writing?" Mabel asked. He looked at her. "The resolution," she said carefully. "Was there a document, a confirmation from the land office?" The silence that followed that question was long enough to contain its own answer. His filing was in a tin box under the floorboard beside the fireplace, a place he had chosen because it was dry and because he had never expected anyone to look for it. He got it out that evening, after they ate, and spread the papers on the table under the lamp. Mabel sat across from him and read them. She read slowly and carefully, the way she did things she wanted to understand rather than simply get through. Caleb watched her read and found it difficult to read her face while she did it. He knew what the papers contained. He had looked at them twice in 17 years, once when he filed the re-registration and once when Gruber had challenged the well, which had ended up being irrelevant because Gruber backed down before anything legal was required. He knew the shape of the problem without knowing its exact depth, the way a person sometimes knows something is wrong with a structure before they find the specific point of failure. Mabel turned the last page. She was quiet for a moment. She put the page down flat with her palm resting on it. "The re-registration references a surveyor's description," she said. "But the description is attached as a separate document, and what's here is a copy. It says 'copy' in the margin, and there's no seal on it." "I know," he said. "An unsealed copy of a surveyor's attachment without the original land office confirmation receipt." She stopped. She was working through it. "This man Crane, does he work for someone with an interest in the specific land, or is he looking for general irregularities to—" "I don't know yet," Caleb said. "I only got pieces of it in town. Reeves was in the store when I was there, and he stopped talking when I walked in. Which tells me he knows something I don't." "Or that he's involved," Mabel said. Caleb looked at her. "Reeves is on the settlement council," she said. "If a company out of Denver wants mountain land, they need local cooperation to move on the claims. Someone has to facilitate. That's usually someone with a council seat." She said it the way she said most things, levelly, without accusation, as a logical sequence. But the sequence was ugly. He had known Reeves for 12 years. He had not called him a friend, exactly. Caleb did not make friends easily. But he had called him a neighbor, and on the mountain that meant something. "You think Reeves is working with this Crane," he said. "I think it's worth considering," she said. "I think the fact that he stopped talking when you walked in is worth considering." He stood up. He went to the window, not because there was anything to see in the dark outside, but because he needed to move. He stood looking at his own reflection in the glass, a dark and indistinct shape. And he thought about 19 years on this land and what it meant that someone from Denver with a briefcase and a legal question could put those 19 years in a precarious position. "The original confirmation receipt," he said, "if it exists anywhere, it would be in the Territorial Land Office in Carson Falls." Which is 40 miles east, Mabel said. In winter, he said. In winter, she agreed. He turned back to the room. She was still sitting at the table with his papers in front of her, lamplight on her face, and she was not panicking. He noticed this specifically. She was not panicking. She was not offering false comfort. She was not telling him it would be fine. She was sitting with the actual dimensions of the problem and looking at it clearly. I need to know exactly what Crane is saying, he said. Not through Reeves, directly. That means going back down, she said. Tomorrow, if the road holds. She nodded. She looked at the papers again. I want to copy these before you take them anywhere, she said. If the originals are out of your hands for any reason, you need a record of exactly what they say. You can do that? I can write, she said, in a tone that reminded him, gently, of what a foolish question that was. He sat back down. She got her notebook and turned to a clean page and began copying the documents, word for word, in her precise angular hand. He watched her work. Outside the mountain held its cold and dark. The lamp burned steadily between them. He went down the mountain the next morning to find Aldous Crane, and Aldous Crane was not what he'd pictured. He had pictured a sharp-suited city man with the easy manner of someone accustomed to dealing in other people's difficulties. What he found at the Mercer lodging house, sitting at the small table in the common room with papers arranged before him and a cup of coffee that had gone cold, was a man of about 50 with a tired, heavy face and the deliberate movements of someone who had been doing disagreeable work for a long time and had arrived at a professional relationship with the unpleasantness of it. Crane looked up when Caleb came in. He did not look surprised. Mr. Whitaker, he said. You know who I am, Caleb said. I know most of the upper mountain names, Crane said. He gestured to the chair across from him. Sit down if you want. I'd rather stand. Crane shrugged. He was not a man who needed Caleb to be comfortable. I imagine you've heard some version of why I'm here, he said. I heard you're looking at claim irregularities on the upper mountain, Caleb said. I want to know exactly which irregularities and who's asked you to look. The company I represent is... I know about the company, Caleb said. I'm asking who specifically made contact with them. Who brought this to their attention? Crane looked at him for a moment. He picked up his cold coffee and set it back down. That's not information I'm in a position to share, he said. What I can tell you is that the company has identified a set of claims on the upper mountain that were re-registered under the Territorial Standardization of 1869 without complete documentation. Your claim is among them. My re-registration was filed correctly, Caleb said. It was filed, Crane said. Whether correctly is the question. He sorted through his papers without hurry. The surveyor's description attached to your re-registration filing is an unsealed copy. Without the original or a sealed copy with the land office stamp, the attachment is considered provisional. Provisional attachments that were not confirmed within the standardization window, which closed in 1871, are technically voidable. The word landed in the room. Voidable, Caleb said. It means the claim can be challenged through proper legal process, Crane said. Not automatically voided. Challenged. If the company chooses to pursue it, the challenge would go to the territorial court. You would have the opportunity to produce the original documentation or a proper certified copy. And if I can't produce it? Crane was quiet for a moment. Then the court would consider the claim disputed, he said, and disputed claims on unimproved upper mountain land. He stopped. He seemed briefly like a man who was not enjoying the sentence he was about to complete. They tend to resolve in favor of the challenging party when the challenging party has legal resources and the original claimant does not. Caleb stood very still. Who else? He said. You said my claim is among them. Who else on the upper mountain? I'm not in a position. Gruber, Caleb said. The upper pasture. Crane said nothing, which was an answer. Holloway, Caleb said. Still nothing. Is Reeves' land in question? Caleb said. Crane looked at him. Mr. Reeves' holdings are in the Valley section, he said. Valley claims under a different registration timeline. Which meant no. Which meant Reeves was untouched. Which meant Mabel had been right. He rode back up the mountain faster than was wise given the road conditions, and the horse complained about it in the way horses do. The tense, resistant quality of an animal that knows the footing is wrong and is being asked to ignore it. He eased off. He made himself ease off. Arriving home faster by 10 minutes was not worth arriving home with a horse that had gone down on the ice. He thought about Crane's face when he said voidable. The man had the affect of someone delivering a medical verdict, accurate, professional, not personally cruel, but the information itself was cruel, and the professionalism was a kind of insulation from having to feel that. He thought about the land office in Carson Falls, 40 miles east, and what the roads between here and there looked like in the second week of December, and how many days a round trip would take in these conditions, and whether the original documentation existed in their files or had been lost in the reorganization the territorial office had done after the standardization window closed, which he had heard had been chaotic and badly managed. He thought about Mabel copying his documents at the kitchen table the night before, her hand moving steadily across the page in the lamplight. She was waiting when he got back. She had not asked him to come back by a certain time, but she was standing in the doorway when he came up the lane, which told him she had been watching. He told her everything, all of it, precisely, in the order it had happened. He had found, since her arrival, that she required complete information and that providing anything less, softening a detail, omitting a complication, was a form of disrespect she had not earned. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Carson Falls?" "Carson Falls," he said. "If the original sealed document exists, it's there. If I can get a certified copy from the land office, it resolves the question entirely." Crane said as much. "Produce the original or a proper certified copy, and the challenge can't proceed." 40 miles, she said. "In this weather, 3 days out and back if nothing goes wrong. Longer if something does." She was quiet. She was calculating. He could almost see it. The variables arranging themselves in her mind, the supply situation, the weather window, the animals, the shed roof, the Grubers 2 miles east with a new infant and a mother who needed checking on. "You can't go alone," she said. He looked at her. "I've traveled worse roads alone." "Alone without someone knowing your position and your timing," she said. "If something happens to you on a mountain road in December with no one expecting you anywhere for 3 days." She stopped. She did not finish that sentence because the completion of it was obvious. "Someone needs to know where you are every day, and someone needs to be here to manage the ranch while you're gone." "You can manage the ranch," he said. "I can manage the ranch," she agreed, without modesty and without boast. "What I can't do is manage the ranch and also know you're all right." He stood with that for a moment. "Gruber," he said, "if I ride by and tell Herschel my route and my expected timeline." "That's better," she said. "And you stop at Herschel's on the way back too, so he knows you're coming." "All right," he said. She turned back to the kitchen. "You should leave day after tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow the temperature is going to drop. I can feel it in the air. And the day after, it'll have stabilized and the road surface will be harder and faster." "You can feel it in the air," he said. "There's a specific quality to the cold the day before a hard freeze," she said. "Wetter, heavier, you can smell it." She was at the shelf, rearranging things. "I learned that from an old man in Ohio who had farmed the same land for 50 years. He said the land talks to you if you listen." He stood in the middle of the cabin. He thought about the old man in Ohio who had taught her to listen to the land, and the German woman who had taught her to treat cheese, and the doctor's household where she had learned whatever she'd learned there, and the livery stable where she'd learned harness work, and all the other people and places that had made up the 34 years of a woman who was now standing at his kitchen shelf, reorganizing his winter supplies in preparation for sending him alone across 40 miles of mountain road. "I need to tell you something," he said. She turned. "When this is resolved, the claim, the documentation, all of it, I want to add your name to the deed." He said it the way he said most things of consequence, which was directly and without decorating it. Not as a gesture. Not as, "I want you on the papers because you belong on them. This is your place too." She looked at him for a long time. Something moved through her face that she did not quite suppress. Not the careful composure he usually saw, but something underneath it, something more exposed. "We've been married 6 weeks, she said. "I know how long we've been married," he said. "People will say you're acting rashly," she said. "I don't particularly care what people say," he said. "You know that." She turned back to the shelf. Her hands rested there for a moment without doing anything. "Ask me again when you're back from Carson Falls," she said quietly, "with the documents in your hand." He understood this. It was not a refusal. It was Mabel's way of keeping the thing real. not letting a decision be made in a charged moment that should be made in a clear one. "All right," he said. He left 2 mornings later as she had predicted. The hard freeze had set in the night before. The road surface was firm and reliable, and the sky was clear in the way that mountain winter skies sometimes went clear as a warning of their own intention to stay cold. She had packed his saddlebag herself the night before. He had watched her do it with the same methodology she applied to everything. Specific items, in specific positions, weight distributed correctly. The most necessary things, most accessible. She put in the document copies she had made, wrapped in oilcloth against moisture. She put in food enough for 4 days without resupply, which was a day's margin past what he'd estimated he needed. She put in a small cloth packet at the last. "What's that?" he asked. "Dried willow bark and yarrow," she said. "If you get fever or pain on the road, you make a tea from it. It's not medicine exactly, but it manages things until you can get to actual medicine." He took the saddlebag. At the door he paused. There was something he wanted to say. He was not a man who said things easily, and the things he wanted to say were not easy things. He stood in the doorway looking at her. "The animals," he started. "I know the animals," she said. "The shed roof after any heavy snow." "Caleb," she said. He stopped. "I've been managing things since before you got back from Harlan's Crossing the first day," she said. "Go get the papers." He went. The road to Carson Falls was exactly as difficult as he'd calculated, and then slightly worse. The first day was manageable. The surface firm as Mabel had predicted, the horse steady, the distance covered at a reasonable pace. He stopped at Herschel Gruber's on the way past and told him the route, the timeline, the expected return. Herschel listened and said he'd watch for him. The second day brought a section of road halfway through the mountain pass, where a section of slope had released. Not a full avalanche, just a sloughing of snow and debris across 20 feet of roadway that required an hour of careful navigation around the edge, taking the horse through trees on a diagonal that was not a road at all and required both of them to concentrate entirely on the next step and nothing else. He made Carson Falls by nightfall of the second day, which was an hour later than he'd planned. The Territorial Land Office was in a stone building near the center of town that had the particular smell of old paper and official indifference. He found the clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers and the manner of someone who had learned to be unhelpful as a form of self-preservation, and explained what he needed. The clerk told him the records from the 1869 standardization window were in the archives section. The archives section was not organized. This was the moment Caleb understood, sitting in the stone building in Carson Falls with the smell of old paper around him and the daylight fading in the window, that the next day was going to be very long. He found lodging for the night and he ate a meal that tasted like nothing compared to what Mabel made from nearly nothing. And he sat in a room that was cold in the way that rooms without proper tending are cold. And he thought about the cabin on the mountain and the fire that would be banked correctly, and the kitchen that would smell of something specific and purposeful. And he understood with a clarity that was almost physical how much had changed in 6 weeks and how completely he could no longer imagine the cabin without her in it. He found the document on the afternoon of the third day. It was in the third box of the third section of the archive, between a claim filing for a silver mine in the Southern Territory and a sheaf of papers that turned out to be someone's personal correspondence that had been misfiled at some point in the past decade. The document itself was a single page, sealed in the lower right corner with the territorial stamp, slightly foxed at the edges, but entirely legible. The surveyor's description. Original, sealed, dated 1869. His name on it. His land described in boundaries that matched his current fence lines exactly. He sat with it in his hands for a moment. Just sat. The clerk made a certified copy with the office seal. Caleb paid the copying fee. He put the original and the certified copy both in the oilcloth wrapping in the saddlebag, next to Mabel's copies of his existing documents. He thanked the clerk, who received this thanks with the neutrality of a man who had watched many desperate people find or not find what they were looking for in that archive, and had learned not to get involved emotionally. He left Carson Falls the following morning at first light. He stopped at Gruber's on the way back, as promised. Herschel came out of the barn when he heard the horse. "You got it?" Herschel said. "I got it," Caleb said. "I got it," Caleb said. Herschel let out a long breath. "What about my upper pasture? You find anything about the—" "I was looking for my claim," Caleb said. But the way the records were organized, or not organized, I saw the general shape of the 1869 filings. Herschel, you need to go to Carson Falls and look for your own sealed surveyor's description. If it's there, you're fine. If it's not, I need to know either way, Herschel said. You need to know either way, Caleb agreed. Herschel was quiet for a moment. Then, how's the road? Manageable. The pass section is cleared now, so there was a slough over the road going east, but it had moved by the time I came back through. He looked toward his mountain, which was visible from the Gruber place as a dark rise against the pale sky. I need to get back. Herschel looked at him with an expression that held something Caleb recognized as a particular kind of understanding, the understanding of a man who has a person he wants to get home to. Go on then, Herschel said. He came up the lane in the late afternoon, the low winter sun coming through the spruce trees at a flat angle that turned the snow bronze and threw long shadows from every post and fence rail. The horse knew the way. He let her have her head. The cabin door opened before he was at the fence. Mabel stood in the doorway, not running out, not dramatic, just standing there with the door open and the firelight behind her, watching him come up the lane. He could see her assessing the horse's gait, his posture, the way he was riding, determining before he was close enough to speak whether something was wrong. He reached into the saddlebag and held up the oilcloth package. She was still for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door to let him in. He came inside. The fire was exactly right. Something was in the pot. He could smell it, something with the pork and dried herbs, the specific warmth of a meal timed for someone's return. He had not told her exactly when to expect him. She had made her own calculation. He put the oilcloth package on the table. She opened it. She took out the original and the certified copy and looked at both of them with the careful attention she gave to documents, reading, verifying, checking the seal. She turned the original over. She looked at the stamp. This is it, she said. That's it, he said. She put them both down on the table. She smoothed the certified copy flat with her palm and looked at it for another moment. Then she looked at him. Really looked. The full attention that he had come to understand was one of the ways she gave something its due weight. You should eat, she said. I know, he said. And then tomorrow, she said, you need to take this to Crane, directly, not through Reeves, directly to Crane, and you put it in front of him, and you make sure he understands that his company's challenge will not proceed. I know, he said. She served the food. He ate. It was better than anything he had eaten in 4 days, which was not difficult since he had eaten almost nothing in 4 days that was worth the description. But even accounting for the contrast, it was good. Genuinely, specifically good in the way her food always was, because she thought about what she was making and why, and what it needed to do for the person eating it. When he had eaten, and they had both been quiet for a while, he said, I'm asking again. She looked up. About the deed, he said. The papers. Your name on them. She held his gaze for a moment. The fire settled in the grate. Outside the mountain was dark and cold and full of the silence of deep winter. All right, she said. Just that. 2 words. But for Mabel, they carried the specific gravity of a decision made by a person who did not make decisions lightly, who had thought about something fully and arrived at a conclusion she intended to keep. He nodded. She gathered the dishes. He sat at the table with the sealed document in front of him, the document that proved what was his, and he thought about what she had said once, that she had come to this mountain because it looked like somewhere that needed what she had. What she had turned out to be considerably larger than either of them had known when she stepped off the stagecoach in her patched dress with her wooden crate and her calm, measuring eyes and her lifetime of hidden knowledge. The mountain had needed all of it, and something in Caleb Whitaker, something that had been locked and frozen far longer than the season, was beginning, slowly and imperfectly and without any guarantee, to thaw. He rode down to Harlan's Crossing the next morning before the settlement had fully woken up. This was deliberate. He wanted to find Crane before Crane had the opportunity to speak with Reeves, before whatever arrangement existed between those two men could organize itself against what Caleb was bringing. The sealed document was in the oilcloth wrapping inside his coat, against his chest, which was not the most comfortable way to carry paper on horseback in the cold, but was the most secure, and security felt important that morning in a way that simple caution usually didn't. The Mercer lodging house had its lamp still burning in the front window when he arrived, which meant the common room was open. He tied the horse and went in without knocking. Crane was at the same table as before. Same papers, different arrangement. The coffee this time was steaming, which meant he had not been sitting there long. He looked up when Caleb came in, and his face did the thing faces do when someone appears earlier than expected. A brief recalibration, a reassessment of the morning's probable shape. "Mr. Whitaker," he said. Caleb sat down across from him without being invited. He took the oilcloth package from inside his coat and placed it on the table between them. He unwrapped it and laid the original surveyor's description and the certified copy side by side, turning them to face Crane. "Original," he said, touching the first page. "Sealed by the Territorial Land Office in 1869. Surveyor's description complete and matching the re-registration filing." He touched the second. "Certified copy from the Carson Falls Land Office, sealed and dated 4 days ago." Crane looked at the documents. He picked up the original and examined the seal. He set it down. He picked up the certified copy. He read it with the careful attention of a man whose job required him to find problems in documents and who was, in this case, not finding one. He set it down. "Well," he said. "The question of my claim's documentation is resolved," Caleb said, "completely and with original evidence. If your company intends to pursue a challenge regardless—" "We don't pursue challenges where the documentation is clean," Crane said. He said it flatly, as a professional fact. "That's not how this works. The company identifies irregularities and pursues where the irregularity is genuine. Where it isn't." He spread his hands slightly. "We move on." "Then we're done," Caleb said. "On your claim," Crane said. "Yes." Caleb looked at him. "The others," he said. "Gruber's upper pasture, the Holloway property." Crane said nothing. His expression was the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to volunteer. "If those claims have the same kind of documentation issue mine appeared to have," Caleb said, "it's worth their knowing they should look for the original sealed descriptions in the Carson Falls archive. The records from the 1869 standardization are disorganized, but they exist. A person who knows what they're looking for can find them." Crane looked at him. "I'm not in a position to advise other claimants," he said. "I know you're not," Caleb said. "I am." He rewrapped the documents and put them back inside his coat. He stood up. "One more thing," he said. He kept his voice level and his hands still, which required some management. "Who brought this to your company's attention? The Upper Mountain claim specifically. I'd like to know." "I told you before. I know what you told me before," Caleb said. "I'm asking again." Crane looked at him for a long moment. He was a man who had done disagreeable work long enough to recognize when he was sitting across from someone who already knew the answer and was simply testing whether the person opposite them would be honest about it. "The referral came through a local council contact," Crane said finally. "The arrangement was that the contact would receive a percentage of any settlement on successfully challenged claims." He picked up his coffee. "I'll tell you that the contact's name is not something I'll provide, but I'll also tell you that now that your claim is documented, there's no percentage to be had from your land, and the contact's involvement in the other claims was—" He paused. "The contact's involvement was predicated on those claims being straightforward acquisitions. If the other claimants produce documentation, the picture changes considerably." He drank his coffee. The room was quiet. Caleb walked out. He found Herschel Gruber's eldest boy, young Thomas, at the feed post where he was picking up a supply order for his father. Thomas was 16 and had the Gruber build, wide through the shoulders, deliberate in movement, and the Gruber practicality, which meant when Caleb told him what he'd found in Carson Falls and what he needed Herschel to do, the boy listened without interrupting and repeated back the key points with the accuracy of someone who understood the stakes. "Tell your father to go to Carson Falls as soon as the road will bear the wagon," Caleb said. "Tell him what to look for. The 1869 filing boxes, the surveyor's description with the territorial seal. Tell him it's there or it isn't, and either way, he needs to know." "Yes, sir," Thomas said. "And the Holloways," Caleb said. "Does your father know them well enough to carry a message?" "Father knows everyone," Thomas said, in the tone of a boy who found this both true and occasionally burdensome. "Tell him about the Holloways too," Caleb said. He rode home. Mabel was at the storage shed when he came up the lane. He could see her there, doing the inventory check she did every few days, notebook in hand, breath visible in the cold air. She looked up at the sound of the horse. He shook his head slightly, then corrected the gesture. Not a negative shake, more a settling, an indication that things had resolved. She nodded once and went back to her notebook. He stabled the horse. He came out of the barn and stood for a moment in the yard, looking at the shed, the cabin, the line of spruce trees against the pale sky. The land. His land. And soon, if he had anything to say about it, hers too. He went inside and built the fire up higher than usual, because the afternoon was going to be cold, and he wanted the room warm for what he was going to do next. What he was going to do next was write a letter. Not to the land office, which was settled. Not to Crane's company, which was also settled. To the Territorial Council's oversight office in the capital, which was 300 miles away and which handled complaints about local council conduct. He sat at the table with a blank page in front of him, and he thought about what he knew and what he could prove, and how much of it was worth putting into a formal letter, and how much of it would simply vanish into the considerable distance between here and anywhere that mattered. Mabel came in from the shed. She looked at the blank page. She looked at him. "I'm writing to the Territorial Oversight Office," he said. "About Reeves," she said. "I can't prove it's Reeves specifically," he said. Crane confirmed a local council contact with a percentage arrangement, but he wouldn't give a name. "What I can document is the pattern. A company from Denver targeting upper mountain claims with a specific kind of documentation irregularity, arriving shortly after what appears to be a local referral, with the council contact standing to profit from successful challenges." He tapped the blank page. "That's enough to ask for an inquiry. Maybe not enough to get one, but enough to ask." She sat down. She looked at the page for a moment. "Do you know how to write a letter to a government office?" she asked. "I know how to write a letter," he said. "I don't know if I know how to write one that gets read." "Those are different skills," she agreed. A pause. "I spent 3 years as housekeeper for a lawyer's family," she said, "in Cincinnati. I read a great many letters written to government offices. I know what they look like when they work and what they look like when they don't." He looked at her. "Tell me what you want to say," she said. "I'll tell you how to say it." They worked on the letter for 2 hours. It was not an easy process. He knew the facts but tended to present them in the compressed, impatient way of a man unaccustomed to explaining himself. And she kept slowing him down, asking him to unpack assumptions that were clear to him but would not be clear to someone 300 miles away with no knowledge of Harlan's Crossing, or its council, or its specific landscape of relationships and obligations. The letter went through 3 drafts on the back pages of her notebook before they arrived at something that said what needed saying in a way that a distant official might actually follow. She wrote the final version in her own hand because her handwriting was more legible than his. "This is your letter," he said. "It should be in your hand?" "It's our letter," she said, "and legible is better than attributed." He read the final version. It was precise and organized and made the case clearly, without accusation that couldn't be substantiated, and without emotion that would undermine the credibility of the facts. It was, he thought, better than anything he could have written alone. Better, probably, than what he would have written if he'd been too proud to ask for help. "Thank you," he said. "It needed doing," she said, which was always what she said. December moved through its middle weeks with the particular grinding quality of mountain winter in full operation. The cold did not relent. The road to Harlan's Crossing was passable on good days and inadvisable on bad ones. They fell into the rhythm of a household managing a hard season. The specific, repetitive work of keeping animals fed and water unfrozen and supplies organized and fire maintained, which sounds simple and is not, which sounds like endurance and is also that, but is also something else, the accumulation of shared days. He noticed things. He noticed that she had a way of sitting near the fire in the evenings when the day's work was done, not idle exactly, never entirely idle, usually mending something or writing in the notebook or sometimes simply reading from a small book she'd had in her crate that she'd never mentioned, that had a quality of settledness to it, of rightful occupation, as if she had always been in that chair, as if the chair had always been there for her. He noticed that she laughed, not often and not performatively, but when something struck her as genuinely funny, she laughed with a quality of surprise, as if she were slightly startled each time by the fact of her own amusement. He had said something one evening about the way one of the ewes had been looking at him lately, a remark that he'd intended as an observation and that came out as something closer to a complaint, and she had laughed, that surprise laugh, and then covered it with her hand in a reflex that looked like the reflex of a woman who had spent a long time in situations where laughter needed to be managed. He did not comment on it, but he noticed. He noticed that she had opinions about nearly everything and expressed them precisely and without apology, when asked and sometimes when not asked, and that this quality, which he had initially found startling, he had come to rely on in a way that felt structural. She was an honest person, not cruel honest, not honest as a weapon, but honest in the way that a well-made tool is honest, straightforwardly itself, no gap between what it appears to be and what it does. He was not a man who examined his own feelings with any regularity. He had spent too many years making feelings irrelevant through sheer volume of work. But December, with its long, dark evenings, and its enforced proximity, and its rhythms of shared labor and shared quiet, had produced in him a clarity about certain things that he could no longer avoid by going out to the barn. He was in love with his wife. This was not a comfortable realization, because Caleb Whitaker was not a comfortable man, and love, the word itself, the thing itself, was something he had no real template for. He had not been loved by his parents in any way that taught him what love looked like in practice. He had not had a woman in his life in 19 years. He had arranged a marriage of practical convenience and received something else entirely and had not known what to do with it, except to keep doing the work and pay attention and let it be what it was. He did not know what to do with the realization now, either. So he went to the barn and checked on the animals and came back in and built the fire up and said nothing. The second week of December brought Alma Gruber to their door. She arrived in the afternoon on foot. She had walked the 2 miles from the Gruber place in snowshoes, which was a mode of travel that expressed either urgency or determination or both. And when Mabel opened the door, Alma's face had a complicated quality to it. The look of a woman who has thought carefully about what she's going to say and is now less certain of it than she was before she arrived. "Come in," Mabel said, stepping back. Alma came in. She unwrapped her scarf. She looked at the cabin with the expression of someone seeing it for the second time and registering how much had changed between the two viewings. Then she looked at Mabel. "I need to say something to you," Alma said. "I've been wanting to say it since the baby came. I keep not saying it because I don't know quite how." She stopped. She pressed her lips together briefly. "What you did for Britta. What you did for my family. Before you came, when people were saying things about you. I didn't say those things, but I didn't stop them either, and I should have." The room was quiet. "You had just arrived," Mabel said. "You didn't know me." "I knew enough," Alma said. "I knew you were a woman who had come a long way to a hard place and deserved to be given a chance. I knew that was true, and I still let Dorothy Reeves talk the way she talked without saying a word." She looked at Mabel directly. "I'm sorry for that." Mabel studied her for a moment. Then she said, "Sit down." Alma sat. Mabel put water on. She set out 2 cups. She sat across from Alma and said, "Dorothy Reeves is not your responsibility. Her voice is hers." "I know that," Alma said, "but silence has a voice too. That's what I've been sitting with." Mabel nodded slowly. "How is Britta?" she asked. "And the baby?" Something released in Alma's face. The tight thing let go a little, replaced by something warmer and more specifically joyful than anything else she'd shown. "Both strong. The baby is—" She shook her head. "Herschel says he's the loudest thing on the mountain, and Herschel is not wrong. He's been named Carl Herschel Gruber." "That's a solid name," Mabel said. Britta wanted to name him after someone from her family, but the family name was difficult to say in English. Alma paused. She wanted me to ask if you would— The baby needs to be registered, in town, and Britta wants you to be listed as one of the witnesses to the birth, as someone who was present and official." Mabel held her coffee cup and said nothing for a moment. "That's Britta's choice to make," she said. "If she wants me there, I'll be there." "She wants you there," Alma said. After Alma left, refreshed, slightly lighter, in the way people sometimes are after saying the thing they came to say, Caleb, who had been in the barn during the visit and came in afterward and heard the summary of it, stood at the fire and thought about what it meant that Alma Gruber had walked 2 miles in snowshoes to apologize to Mabel Hartwell. "She didn't have to do that," he said. "No," Mabel agreed. She was already back at the kitchen shelf. But she did. Does that change anything for you about how you feel about the people here? She considered this genuinely, the way she considered things she actually wanted to answer honestly. I don't have simple feelings about groups of people, she said. I have feelings about specific people doing specific things. Alma walked 2 miles to tell me something true. That matters. She moved a tin. Dorothy Reeves will do what Dorothy Reeves does. That also matters, but differently. He thought about that. And me? He said. It came out before he had entirely decided to say it. She turned to look at him. The question was specific enough that both of them understood exactly what it was asking, and broad enough that neither of them could pretend it was about something else. You walked toward me on a frozen street in front of people who were laughing, she said, when you could have looked the other way. She held his gaze. That mattered from the first day. I just didn't know yet how much of the rest of you was going to match it. He stood at the fire. And now? He said. And now I know more of the rest of you, she said. She turned back to the shelf. Ask me something harder. He almost smiled. For Caleb Whitaker, almost smiling was approximately equivalent to laughing, and she caught it, and her own expression did the thing it did when she was amused. That brief surprise, quickly managed. Reeves came 3 days later. Not to the cabin. Reeves did not come to the cabin. He sent a message through young Thomas Gruber, who had apparently become an informal courier for the Upper Mountain community, asking Caleb to come to a council meeting in Harlan's Crossing on Friday, described as a general community meeting about winter concerns. Caleb read the message. He handed it to Mabel. She read it. Winter concerns, she said. That's what it says. Is there a winter concern that requires a council meeting? Not that I know of, he said. He knows about the letter to the oversight office, she said. Caleb looked at her. How would he? Because men like Reeves have arrangements with men like Crane, she said, and men like Crane close up their operations tidily when they move on, which includes letting their local contact know the situation has changed and why. She set the note down. He wants to see what you know and what you intend to do with it. And what do I intend to do with it? Exactly what you're already doing, she said. The letter is sent. The documentation is secure. You go to the meeting, you say nothing about the oversight letter. You let him show you what his position is now that the challenge to your claim has collapsed, and you pay attention. You think I should go, he said. I think not going tells him something, she said. Attending tells him something else. What does attending tell him? That you're not afraid of him, she said, and that you're watching. He went to the Friday meeting. The council meeting was held in the back room of Eleanor Hoyt's house, which was the settlement's unofficial meeting space for anything requiring more gravitas than a general supper. There were 8 men present, the 4 council members, including Reeves, and 4 Upper Mountain landholders, including Caleb and, to his mild surprise, Herschel Gruber, who had apparently received a similar summons and had apparently decided the same thing Caleb had decided about what attending versus not attending communicated. Eleanor Hoyt was not present, which was interesting. It was her house, and she was not there. Reeves opened the meeting in the manner of a man who had prepared an opening, smooth, confident, the kind of prepared that is meant to look spontaneous. He talked about the hard winter, about the importance of community solidarity on the mountain, about shared resources and neighbor helping neighbor. He talked about the challenges facing small settlement landholders in the current territorial climate, with larger outside interests creating pressures on local families. He talked about the council's role in protecting those families. He did not mention Crane. He did not mention Denver. He did not mention claims challenges, or land documentation or percentage arrangements. Caleb sat and listened and let Reeves talk. Herschel sat next to him and also listened, with the particular stillness of a large man who has decided that stillness is more effective than motion. When Reeves finished his opening, he looked at Caleb with an expression of careful warmth. Caleb, he said, I know you've had some concerns lately about outside interests making inquiries in the settlement. I want you to know the council takes that seriously. Do you? Caleb said. Absolutely, Reeves said. If there are men coming in from outside and asking questions about land claims, that's exactly the kind of thing the council should be informed about, so we can address it, formally. The room was quiet. Caleb thought about Mabel at the table with his documents spread in front of her on the first night, reading carefully, asking the right question about sealed copies. He thought about her writing the oversight letter in her steady hand. He thought about her saying, "Let him show you what his position is now." "The situation with the outside inquiry has been resolved," Caleb said. "My claim documentation is complete and confirmed. I went to Carson Falls and retrieved the original sealed surveyor's description." Something moved through Reeves's face. Not much. The man had too much practice for it to be obvious. But something. A slight reassessment. "That's good to hear," Reeves said. "That's exactly the kind of outcome the council wants for every family on this mountain." "Herschel will be making the same trip," Caleb said, without looking at Herschel. "Once the road's manageable, to confirm his upper pasture documentation." Reeves looked at Herschel. Herschel looked back at Reeves with the expression of a man who has farmed the same land for 20 years and knows exactly where his fence lines are and is not afraid of anyone who would like to suggest otherwise. "That's sensible," Reeves said, after a pause. "We thought so," Herschel said. The meeting proceeded. Other topics were raised: a section of the settlement road that needed attention in the spring, a dispute about grazing rights on the lower meadow that had nothing to do with the upper mountain situation. Caleb participated where relevant and was quiet where not. He watched Reeves. Reeves watched him. At the end, as people were putting on their coats, Reeves came to Caleb's side, casually, as if by proximity, not intention. "I heard you've been settling in well," Reeves said, his voice lower now, private. "Your wife. People have been saying good things." "Have they?" Caleb said. "Dorothy had some concerns early on," Reeves said. He smiled, the practiced kind. "You know Dorothy." "I do," Caleb said. "Water under the bridge," Reeves said, with an expansive quality, a forgiving quality, as if he were extending a generosity. Caleb buttoned his coat. He looked at Reeves for a moment, at the careful, managed face, at the smile that didn't reach the eyes, at the hands that were too relaxed. He thought about the word voidable and what it would have meant for his 19 years on the mountain if Mabel hadn't sat across from him with his documents and asked the right question on the right night. "Reeves," he said, "I know what the council contact arrangement with Crane's company looked like. I know what the percentage structure was. I know whose land was and wasn't included in the targeting." Reeves's smile stayed in place. "I'm not interested in pursuing it publicly," Caleb said. "I've got my documentation. Herschel will get his. The company is moving on. What I am interested in is making sure it doesn't happen again." He pulled on his gloves. "I want that understood." A pause. "Understood," Reeves said. His voice had lost its practiced warmth. What was underneath it was harder and less comfortable, but more honest. Caleb nodded. He went out to his horse. "Oh," she almost smiled. Not quite, but the thing that happened near her eyes was in the vicinity. "All right, Ati, she said, "before the end of December." He nodded. Outside the mountain held its silence, which had been his companion for 19 years, and was now simply the backdrop to something that required considerably more of him, in every direction, than silence ever had. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. The fire settled and the lamp burned and the wind went through the spruce trees with its sound of running water, steady and indifferent and entirely unchanged by anything that happened inside the cabin, which was, he had come to understand, both the truth of the mountain and entirely beside the point. The point was in here. The point had walked off a stagecoach in a patched dress and lifted her own luggage and looked toward the mountain and said she was ready. She had been more ready than anyone watching that day could possibly have known, including, he suspected, herself. They went to Harlan's Crossing on the 20th of December. The road had been passable for 3 days running, which was as good as they were going to get before the year turned, and Caleb had watched the weather signs the way Mabel had taught him to watch them. The quality of the cold, the direction of the wind off the northern ridge, the particular stillness that preceded a stable stretch, and the morning of the 20th had all the characteristics of a day that intended to hold. She wore her good dress. He noticed this without commenting on it. It was not the patched one she'd arrived in. That one had been mended so many times it served now as a work dress, but a darker one she'd had folded at the bottom of her travel bag, brought for occasions she hadn't known yet would arise. She had pressed it flat near the fire the night before. She wore her heavy coat over it and her good scarf, and she looked, when she came down from the loft that morning, like a woman who had decided the occasion warranted the effort without making a performance of the decision. Caleb had shaved. She did not comment on this either. They rode down in the wagon because the notary required witnesses and ink and a proper surface for signing, none of which were well served by horseback. The road was firm, and the horse moved steadily, and they sat beside each other in the particular companionable quiet that had become their normal. Not the managed silence of two strangers being careful, but something more settled, the quiet of people who have learned each other's rhythms well enough that silence between them carries its own content. Halfway down the mountain, he said, "Are you certain about this?" She looked at him. "Are you asking me or telling me you're uncertain?" "Asking you," he said. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about anything. "The land is yours by 19 years of work," she said. "I've been here less than 2 months. Legally, there's an argument that adding my name is premature." "That's not what I asked," he said. "No," she agreed. "I'm certain." She looked ahead at the road. "I stopped being uncertain around the time you came back from Carson Falls with a sealed document inside your coat and sat down and ate the food I'd made and asked me again without needing to explain why." He kept his eyes on the road. The horse's ears moved in the cold air. "Good," he said. The notary in Harlan's Crossing was a man named Birch, who operated out of the back half of the land office satellite, a single room that smelled of sealing wax and the particular dry mustiness of official paper. He was approximately 60, methodical, and had the specific disinterest of someone who processed other people's important moments many times a day and had arrived at a professional distance from the weight of them. He looked at the deed Caleb set on his desk. He looked at both of them. He asked the standard questions, names, the claim number, the nature of the amendment. He wrote in his ledger. Then he said, "I'll need 2 witnesses, neither of whom is a party to the document." Caleb had anticipated this. He had spoken to Herschel Gruber before they left, and Herschel had said he'd come down that morning on his own business and would be at the feed post by 10. But when Caleb stepped out to look for Herschel, the person he found first, standing at the end of the street with a basket over one arm and an expression of someone who had heard something that required visual confirmation, was Alma Gruber. And beside her, Eleanor Hoyt. Caleb stopped. Eleanor Hoyt looked at him with her direct, angular attention. "Herschel mentioned he was coming down this morning to witness a deed amendment for you," she said, without preamble. "He is," Caleb said. "I told him I'd come along," Eleanor said. "I'd like to be a witness." She said it without explanation or justification, the way women of her type said things they had decided were self-evidently reasonable. He looked at her. He thought about the community supper, Mabel's apple butter on Eleanor's table, the involuntary respect in Eleanor's face when she unwrapped it. He thought about the various shapes that a revision of opinion could take, and how some of them looked like showing up on a cold December morning to witness a document. "All right," he said. "Oh." The 4 of them, Caleb, Mabel, Herschel, Eleanor, crowded into Birch's back room, which was not designed for 4 people in a notary, and managed it without grace but adequately. Birch went through the process with his usual methodical pace, which did not accelerate for the number of people in the room or their collective body heat. He read the amendment aloud. The addition of Mabel Louise Hartwell Whitaker to the deed as joint holder of the claim, with equal rights of ownership and management. He looked at Caleb. "Do you affirm this amendment freely and without duress?" "I do," Caleb said. He looked at Mabel. "Do you affirm your acceptance freely and without duress?" Mabel looked at the document on the desk, at her name on it, in Birch's official hand. She had written her own name thousands of times, in ledgers, on documents, in the margins of her notebook. But she looked at it here the way you look at something that has taken on a different weight by virtue of being in a different place. Her name in an official record, attached to a piece of land on a mountain, alongside the name of a man who had walked toward her on a frozen street when everyone around him was laughing. "I do," she said. Birch stamped it. He had them sign. He had the witnesses sign. He recorded it in his ledger. He handed Caleb the amended deed and said the filing fee was $1.15. Caleb paid it. That was that. Dorothy Reeves was in the general store when they came out of the land office. Caleb saw her through the window, talking to the storekeeper's wife, and he watched the moment she looked out and saw them, saw both of them, together, coming from the direction of the land office. He saw her face do its work. The calculation, the arrival, the particular thinning of the lips that was her version of adjustment. He held the door of the general store open for Mabel. She walked in ahead of him without acknowledging Dorothy's presence in any pointed way. Not snubbing, not performing, simply entering a room in which Dorothy Reeves was one of several people and treating her accordingly. Dorothy said, "Mrs. Whitaker." "Mrs. Reeves," Mabel said pleasantly, moving toward the supply counter. "I heard you've been settling in well," Dorothy said. There was something different in her voice from the last time she had spoken to Mabel. Still careful, still managed, but the register had shifted. The certainty was gone from it. Whatever Mabel had been in Dorothy's mind when she stepped off that stagecoach, the thing Dorothy had laughed at, the punchline, was no longer operating on the same terms. "The mountain suits me," Mabel said. She had the list she'd prepared in her hand, the winter supplies they needed, organized in order of priority. And she was reading it with one eye while addressing Dorothy with the other. "You've done quite a lot," Dorothy said. "From what people say, with the Gruber baby, and," she paused, "people have been talking." "People usually are," Mabel said. She handed the list to the storekeeper. "I hope what they've been saying has been useful to them." Dorothy looked at her for a moment. Something moved through her expression that was not quite an apology. Dorothy Reeves was not built for direct apology, but was in the general territory of one. An acknowledgement, maybe. A concession that the story she had told herself about the large woman on the stagecoach had not turned out to be accurate, and that this inaccuracy had consequences, at least internally. "I thought," Dorothy started. She stopped. She tried again. "When you arrived, I said some things. In the street." "I know what you said," Mabel said. It was unkind," Dorothy said. The words came out like something that had been held for a while and was slightly misshapen from the holding. Mabel looked at her fully for the first time in the conversation. "Yes," she said. "It was." Not letting her off the hook, but not twisting it either. Just the plain truth, delivered without cruelty. "Thank you for saying so." Dorothy nodded once, a tight, uncomfortable nod, and went back to her business, and Mabel went back to her list. Caleb, standing 3 feet away, had heard all of it. He thought about what it took to say yes, it was unkind, and then thank you for saying so in the same breath. The particular discipline of a person who had learned that receiving an apology gracefully was its own skill, one that required more of you than the person doing the apologizing. He went to look at the seed display near the back of the store because he needed to look at something that wasn't Mabel's face right at that moment, for reasons he couldn't have entirely explained. They stopped at the Gruber place on the way back, as they often did now. It had become a natural waypoint, the way certain places become waypoints when the people in them are the kind you want to check on. Britta was up and moving, which was both a good sign and something Mabel immediately addressed. "You should still be resting more than you're resting," Mabel said, watching Britta carry a pot to the fireplace. "I've been sitting for 2 weeks," Britta said. 3 weeks would have been better." "I go insane sitting," Britta said, with the directness of a young woman who had decided that Mabel was the kind of person you could say true things to. "The baby sleeps, the house is quiet, and I think too much." Mabel looked at her. "What do you think about?" Britta set the pot down. She was quiet for a moment. "Whether I'm doing it right," she said. "Whether I'll know what to do when he's sick. Whether I'll know enough." She said it without drama, just honestly, the way fear sounds when it has been alone with itself for a while. "My mother is 2 days' ride from here. I don't have anyone who's done this who I can ask." Mabel sat down at the Gruber table. She folded her hands on the surface. "You can ask me," she said. Britta looked at her. "You don't have children." "No," Mabel said, "but I've been paying attention to people who do since I was young enough to notice. And I've been paying attention to you specifically since the moment you walked into Caleb's cabin that first visit and held your back a certain way when you sat down." She paused. "You'll know what to do when he's sick because you'll watch him until you know what's normal for him specifically, and then you'll notice when it changes, and then you'll respond to what you see rather than what you fear. That's all any mother does. The ones who do it well are simply more honest with themselves about what they're actually seeing." Britta was quiet. Young Carl made a sound from the cradle near the fire. A small, exploratory sound, the sound of someone testing the acoustics of a new world. You make it sound less frightening, Britta said. It is frightening, Mabel said. I didn't say it wasn't. I said you could do it anyway. Caleb, in the doorway, listened to this and thought about the woman who had packed a bag 2 days after arriving on a mountain where she knew no one, in preparation for a birth she'd had no confirmation would happen. He thought about how that kind of readiness was not a talent. It was a choice, made repeatedly, quietly, without audience. The amended deed went into the tin box under the floorboard beside the fireplace when they got home, next to the original sealed surveyor's description and the certified copy from Carson Falls. Mabel was the one who placed it there. She opened the box and laid the document in and looked at it for a moment before she closed the lid. All right, she said, to herself mostly. But he was close enough to hear it. All right, he agreed. She closed the box. He replaced the floorboard. They went about the evening the way they went about evenings. Fire, food, the small necessary inventory of a ranch household preparing itself for another night of cold. But something had shifted in the quality of the ordinary. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would have been visible to an observer. Something internal. A settling, like the sound a structure makes when its weight is finally distributed correctly, when everything bearing load is doing so in proportion and nothing is straining at an angle it wasn't built for. The response from the Territorial Oversight Office came in the second week of January, delivered by the post rider who made the mountain run once a fortnight when the weather allowed. It was not a dramatic document. It was 2 pages in the formal language of official correspondence, acknowledging receipt of Caleb's letter, noting that the matters raised fell within the office's purview, and informing him that an inquiry into the conduct of local council members in the Harlan's Crossing Settlement District had been opened and that he would be contacted if testimony was required. An inquiry, not a resolution, not a punishment, not anything fast or satisfying, just the mechanism of accountability beginning to move, in the slow, grinding way such mechanisms moved in 1879 in a territory 300 miles from the capital. Caleb read the letter at the table. He handed it to Mabel. She read it. She set it down. It's not enough, he said. Not yet. It's something, she said. It's on the record. Reeves will know about it. Reeves already knows the letter was sent, she said. Now he knows it was received. She looked at the document with her clear, unsentimental gaze. A man like Reeves operates on the assumption that nobody is watching closely enough to act. Once that assumption is broken, the calculation changes. He won't stop being who he is, but he'll be more careful. More careful isn't the same as accountable, Caleb said. No, she said. It isn't. She picked up the letter and refolded it. But accountable takes time, and careful is what you get in the meantime, and in the meantime is where most of life happens. He sat with that for a while. There was a particular quality to living with Mabel Hartwell that he had not fully anticipated when he wrote his letter to the agency asking for a practical woman. It was this. She saw things clearly, and she said what she saw, and neither the clarity nor the saying of it was comfortable in the way that pleasant fictions were comfortable, but it was useful in the way that solid ground is useful. Not soft, not yielding, but reliable under your feet when the weather was against you. He had not known he needed that. He had not known what he needed, which was perhaps the core of the problem he'd been living with for 19 years without properly naming it. Herschel Gruber made the trip to Carson Falls in late January, when the road had a brief passable window between 2 hard freezes. He came back with his sealed surveyor's description. He came to tell them in person, arriving at the cabin door with the document in his hand and an expression that was Herschel Gruber's version of triumph, which looked on anyone else like simple relief. Found it in the second box, he said. He held it up. Right where you said. Caleb nodded. Holloway is going next week, Herschel said. He asked me for the details of what to look for. He folded the document and put it away. You should know. He asked how you knew where to look. I told him your wife figured out the core of the problem and told you where to start. Mabel, at the kitchen shelf, did not turn around. But something in her posture changed slightly. A minute adjustment, like a person receiving a thing they had not been expecting and were deciding whether to acknowledge. Caleb said, She did. Herschel nodded. Thought so, he said. He looked at Mabel's back with the direct respect of a man who has particular appreciation for competence because he practices it himself. I want to say something. He said it to the room, which meant to both of them. When you arrived, people had ideas about what kind of person would come here as a mail-order bride. What kind of woman. I didn't say anything foolish out loud, but I had ideas too. He cleared his throat. I was wrong. Mabel turned now. She looked at Herschel with the full attention. You came to a hard place, and you did hard work, and you helped my family in the hardest moment it's had, Herschel said. That's worth more than what anyone thought when you stepped off that stage. I was not a man built for speeches, and the effort of this one was visible on his face, which made it more honest for the visibility. So, that's what I wanted to say. Mabel looked at him for a moment. Thank you, Herschel, she said. Just that. No deflection, no minimizing. She received it the way it was meant. Herschel nodded. He stayed for coffee. He talked with Caleb about the spring fence work, about the price of grain at the settlement store, about young Carl, who was now loud enough to be heard from the barn, according to Henrik. He left after an hour with the manner of a man who has discharged an obligation and feels lighter for it. Spring came the way spring always came to that mountain, not as a gift, but as a negotiation. There were warm days that felt like arrival, and cold snaps that felt like betrayal, and mud that made everything twice as difficult for 3 weeks before the ground finally committed to a new season. Mabel planted. She had been planning it since January. Seeds she'd ordered through the settlement store from a catalog she'd found at Eleanor Hoyt's community supper. Seeds she'd brought in her crate. Plans she'd drawn in the back pages of her notebook for a kitchen garden in the south-facing strip beside the cabin that caught the most sun through the shortest days. Caleb watched her work the soil one morning in early April, turning it with a spade while he mended fence nearby, and he thought about the first day. The cabin that smelled of cold bachelor smoke, the tin with beans, the half an onion, and the distance between that day and this one, which was not just 3 months, but something larger and less measurable. She stopped working and straightened and looked at the turned soil. Tomatoes here, she said, half to herself. The herbs along the north edge of this section, where they'll have some shelter. She marked the air with her finger. If we put in a cold frame along this wall. She stopped. She looked at him. What? Nothing, he said. You're watching me. I watch you, he said. She looked at him the way she looked at things she was deciding how to respond to honestly. I know, she said. I watch you too. He went back to the fence, but something that had been in the vicinity of a smile stayed on his face for longer than was strictly warranted by the conversation. Eleanor Hoyt came to visit in May, alone, without Alma or any social pretext. She came and she sat at the table and she drank coffee and she looked at the cabin, the order of it, the kitchen garden visible through the window already showing green at the edges, the dried herbs, the notebook on the shelf. And she said, I'd like to ask you something. Mabel said she could ask. The women in the settlement, Eleanor said carefully, there are things they don't know that would help them through the winters. About preserving food, about preparation, about some of the things you've been doing here that have changed how this cabin functions. She set her cup down. I'd like you to think about whether you'd be willing to share some of it at a gathering, not one of my suppers, something more practical, something where women who are struggling with the same problems you've solved could learn what you know. Mabel was quiet for a moment. You're asking me to teach, she said. I'm asking if you'd consider it, Eleanor said. You don't have to decide now. Mabel looked at her. Why are you asking me specifically? There are women in this settlement who've lived here longer. There are women who have endured longer, Eleanor said. That's not the same as knowing more. And the women who've endured, they've endured because they found their own solutions privately. They don't share. They don't see why they should. She looked at Mabel directly. You share. I've seen it. With Britta, with Alma, with me that first night when I unwrapped what you brought and you explained how you'd made it. You explain things as if you expect the person listening to be capable of understanding. She paused. It's not as common a quality as you might think. Mabel sat with this for a long moment. She looked at her coffee. She thought about the doctor's family in Cincinnati, and the German woman who taught her about cheese, and the old farmer in Ohio who had taught her to listen to what the land said, and all the people who had handed her something of what they knew as if it were a natural thing to do, as if knowledge were a thing that increased by distribution rather than diminished. All right, she said. I'll do it. The gathering happened on a Saturday in June at Eleanor's house. with 11 women from the settlement. Mabel brought samples, 3 kinds of preserved food, 2 herb preparations for common winter ailments, and a written list in her precise hand of what she would cover, because she had learned that people organized around a list. She was not a natural speaker in the performance sense. She was not warm in the way that makes a room comfortable from the first moment. What she was, in front of those 11 women, was the same thing she always was. Specific, honest, willing to explain from the beginning without assuming what people knew and without condescending about what they didn't. She told them what she knew and why it worked. Dorothy Reeves was there. She sat toward the back. She asked 2 questions during the session, both practical, both specific, both the questions of a woman who had been managing a household for 20 years and had encountered the problems Mabel was describing and wanted to know if the solutions were better than the ones she'd arrived at herself. One of them was. Mabel said so plainly. Dorothy wrote it down. After the gathering, Eleanor walked Mabel to the wagon where Caleb was waiting. She said, "Same time next month?" Mabel looked at her. "If people come," she said. "They'll come," Eleanor said. They came. Every month through the summer and into the fall, a gathering that grew from 11 to 17 to eventually 23 women making the trip from different parts of the mountain settlement to sit in Eleanor Hoyt's expanded parlor and learn what Mabel Hartwell had spent 34 years accumulating from every person and place that had passed through her life. In September, a second letter arrived from the Territorial Oversight Office. It was longer than the first. It informed Caleb that the inquiry into council conduct in the Harlan's Crossing district had concluded. It informed him that one council member, unnamed in the letter, but Caleb had never required a name to be written down to know the name, had resigned his seat following the inquiry's findings. It informed him that new council elections would be held in October. It was not dramatic. There was no arrest, no public accounting, no moment of visible justice in the town square. Reeves resigned quietly, and the settlement heard about it in pieces, and by the time the full understanding of why had circulated through Harlan's Crossing, it had been diluted by the usual mechanisms of local self-protection. The reluctance of people to fully believe the worst about a neighbor, the tendency to soften the story in the retelling. But the seat was empty, and the inquiry was on the record, and the land on the upper mountain, Caleb's, Herschel's, the Holloways, sat under no cloud. Caleb told Mabel the night the letter arrived. He read it aloud at the table. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Is it enough?" he asked. He found himself asking her this more and more, not because he lacked his own opinion, but because her opinion had a quality of honesty that clarified his own. "It's what happened," she said. "The land is secure. The arrangement that threatened it is broken. The man who facilitated it has lost the position that made it possible." She folded her hands on the table. "Is it the full accounting I would have wanted?" "No. Is it real?" "Yes." He nodded. "Real is enough," she said. "Real is what you can build on." He found her one evening in October sitting in the chair by the fire with the small book from her crate. She read it periodically, never for long, always with the same quality of attention that she gave to her notebook, as if the book were a conversation she returned to rather than a text she consumed. He asked her, that evening, what it was. She showed him the spine. It was a collection of essays by a woman naturalist he had never heard of, published in the 1850s, about the observation of natural systems. He looked at it and handed it back. "What does she say?" he asked. Mabel opened to a page she had apparently returned to often. He could see the slight warping of the paper at the margin, the evidence of a hand resting there many times. She read him a sentence. It was about the way forests managed dead wood, how what looked like failure and ending was in fact the slow redistribution of what had been built into what would be built next. How the fallen thing fed the standing thing. How nothing in a functioning system was wasted, only transformed. He sat with it. "That's what you think about," he said. It was not a question. "Sometimes," she said, she closed his book. "I think about the people who taught me things. The German woman, the farmer in Ohio, the lawyer's family. I think about how what they handed me became what I could hand to other people." She looked at the fire. "I used to wonder if carrying what other people taught you was enough. If it counted as something you had built yourself." She paused. "I've decided it does. I've decided that's exactly what building something is. You take what was handed to you and you add what you've learned and you pass it forward. The thing that comes out is yours." He was quiet. "The women who came to Eleanor's this summer," she said, "some of them will do things with what they learned that I can't predict. They'll solve problems I haven't encountered. They'll teach their daughters. Their daughters will teach someone else." She set the book on her knee. "That's more than I could have done alone. That's more than any of it would have been if I'd stayed in Cincinnati and married a man who thought my size was a problem." He looked at her across the firelight. "His loss," he said. She almost laughed. The surprised kind quickly managed. "Yes," she said. "His loss." Winter came back, as it always did. The mountain did not soften for anyone, and it did not make exceptions, and it did not reward sentiment. The cold returned in October and settled in by November, and by December the road was doing its annual impersonation of a thing that might or might not exist, depending on the weather's mood. But the storage shed had been properly repaired over the summer. Not the patch job of the previous winter, but a full structural correction. Caleb and Herschel working 2 days together while Mabel directed the load distribution with her notebook and her quiet precision. The kitchen garden had been harvested and preserved in quantities that made the shelf inventory substantially different from what it had been a year before. The cabin had been re-chunked, the step properly replaced, the loft partition upgraded to something sturdier. The tin box under the floorboard held the surveyor's description and its certified copy and the amended deed with 2 names on it. On the first heavy snow of the new winter, Mabel stood at the cabin window and watched the accumulation. She had her coffee, and she had her notebook, and she had the specific quality of settledness that Caleb had been watching grow in her over 12 months. Not the stillness of someone who had stopped wanting, but the stillness of someone who was where they had chosen to be and had made peace with the cost of that choice and found the cost worth it. He came to stand beside her at the window. He looked at the snow. He looked at the land, their land, the word carrying a weight now that it had never carried when it was only his. "Same forecast as last year?" he said. "Worse," she said. "I can smell it." "Then we're ready," he said. She looked at him sideways. "We're more ready than last year," she said. "We're not ready the way things are ready when nothing can go wrong." "Nothing's ever ready that way," he said. "No," she said. "That's why you prepare." He put his hand over hers on the windowsill, not dramatically, not with any particular announcement. Just placed it there, his roughened rancher's hand over her capable one, the way you rest something heavy on a surface you trust to hold it. She did not pull away. She turned her hand over briefly and pressed his, and then they both went back to looking at the snow. This is the part that is hardest to explain to someone who has not lived it, the plain, unspectacular texture of a life built correctly. There is no single moment that names it. There is no morning you wake up and know that you have arrived at something worth having. There is only the accumulation of days in which 2 people did the work in front of them honestly and without pretense, and without requiring the other person to be something other than what they were. Mabel Hartwell had come to a mountain where nobody expected her to last the first cold snap. She had lasted, and then she had done considerably more than last, and the doing of it had required every skill she had accumulated from every person who had been decent enough to teach her something when she was paying attention. What she built on that mountain was real. Not perfect. Nothing she would have called perfect, because she had too clear an eye for what things actually were versus what you wished they were. But real. A home with warmth in it. A partnership with honesty in it. A community with something it hadn't had before, which was a woman who shared what she knew as if knowledge were a form of generosity rather than a form of power. The world had told her, at various points and in various voices, that her size was her definition, that it preceded her, that it was the first and most important thing anyone needed to know. The world had been wrong, and she had known it was wrong, and she had lived accordingly, not loudly, not in defiance, but with the quiet persistence of a person who understood that proving something and being something were the same act performed over time, and that the only audience that ultimately mattered was the person you saw when the lamp went out and the room went dark and there was no one left to perform for. She had come to a mountain with a worn travel bag and a wooden crate and a lifetime of what she knew. She had made it count. The snow came down and the fire held, and outside the spruce trees moved in the wind with their sound like running water, steady and indifferent, and entirely unchanged by everything that had happened inside this small, patched, increasingly solid cabin on the eastern slope. Inside, everything had changed, and that was enough. That was